The ranch manager's hand came down flat on the kitchen table so hard the tin cups rattled. "You want to tell me," Roy Tanner said, his voice low and ugly, "that a woman who's been here 4 days is going to stand in my kitchen and tell me how I run this ranch?" Elena Whitmore didn't step back. She didn't look away. She kept her eyes on his face and let the silence sit there between them, like something neither one of them wanted to be the first to touch. "I'm telling you the flour has weevils," she said, "and the beef Voss delivered last Tuesday was already turning when it came off the wagon." Tanner smiled. It was the kind of smile that wasn't one. "Lady," he said, "Harlan Voss has supplied this ranch for 11 years. You've been here since Thursday." She said nothing. "Pack your things by morning," he told her, "or learn to cook what you're given." 27 men, working 16-hour days, eating food that was quietly poisoning their strength week by week. And the man responsible for it was standing right in front of her, telling her to be quiet. If you've ever been dismissed by someone who had less sense than power, if you've ever watched the wrong person win simply because they had the authority to make it stick, then you already know exactly what Elena Whitmore felt in that moment. And you already know she wasn't going to pack her things. If this story already has you leaning forward, we'd love for you to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Because the stories we tell here don't go the way anyone expects. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. It means more than you know to see how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to where it started. Elena had not come to Dust Creek Ranch looking for trouble. That was the honest truth, and she held on to it even later, when trouble had found her so thoroughly that looking back on the beginning felt like reading about a different person entirely. She had come because she needed work. That was the whole of it. No hidden motive, no long game, no plan beyond getting through the next month without borrowing money she had no reasonable expectation of paying back. The letter from the Dust Creek Ranch Management Office had been plain enough. Cook needed, room and board provided, $30 a month. She had read it twice, standing at the post office counter in Millhaven, folded it carefully, and walked directly to the livery to arrange a ride west. She was 26 years old. She had grown up in a household where food was not a luxury, but a discipline. Her mother had kept books on every pound of flour, every jar of preserved vegetables, every cut of meat that came through the kitchen door. Not because they were poor exactly, but because they were careful. Because carefulness was the only wall between a family and the kind of trouble that arrived without warning. Elena had inherited that carefulness the way other women inherited jewelry or land. What she had not inherited was patience for waste. She arrived at Dust Creek on a Thursday morning in late June, and by Thursday afternoon she understood that something at this ranch was deeply wrong. It was not dramatic the way she figured it out. There was no single moment of revelation. It was instead a series of small observations that added up quietly, the way water adds up behind a dam, not a flood yet, but you could already feel the pressure if you knew where to put your hand. The kitchen itself was large and serviceable, built for the kind of cooking that needs to feed a crew rather than impress a dinner table. 2 large iron stoves, a long wooden prep surface that had been scrubbed to gray, shelving along the back wall, a root cellar accessible through a low door near the south corner. Elena walked through it alone that first afternoon, while the previous cook, a sour-faced man named Briggs who had apparently quit without notice, finished loading his personal belongings into a canvas bag near the door. She didn't ask him why he was leaving. She could already see the shape of it. The flour barrel nearest the stove had a fine dark powder along the interior seam that she recognized immediately. She reached in and pulled out a small handful, held it to the light from the single east-facing window. The movement inside the flour was subtle, but it was there. "How long has this barrel been open?" she asked without turning around. Briggs didn't answer for a moment. She heard him tie off the top of his canvas bag. "Week and a half, maybe 2, he finally said. "Where does the supply come from?" Another pause. "Voss Trading, same as everything." She set the flour down and moved along the shelving. Cornmeal that had been improperly sealed. Salt that had begun to cake from moisture, which meant the storage was damp somewhere, or the barrel itself had a hairline crack. 2 sacks of dried beans that felt lighter than they should. She lifted one, pressed along the seam, and found a split that had been temporarily mended with a strip of rough cloth. Someone had tried to hide it. "Does Tanner inspect these deliveries?" she asked. This time Briggs laughed. Not a friendly sound. "Tanner doesn't inspect anything," he said. "Tanner signs the receipt and sends the bill to Caldwell's office in Abilene. That's the whole of his interest in it." He picked up his bag, nodded at her once, not unkindly, just with the flat expression of a man who has made peace with something she hadn't yet encountered, and walked out. Elena stood alone in the kitchen for a long moment. Then she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She spent the rest of that day in a kind of methodical fury. Not anger, not yet. Something more controlled than that. She went through every barrel, every sack, every sealed tin on the shelving. She made a list on the back of an old receipt she found folded near the window ledge. She wrote down every item that was compromised, every item that was borderline, and every item that was sound. By the time the light started to fade, she had a complete picture, and it was not a good one. The food coming into Dust Creek Ranch was bad. Not occasionally, systematically. Not from carelessness, which could be fixed with better attention, but from something deliberate, which required a different approach entirely. She didn't go to Tanner that first evening. She needed to cook supper first, and she needed to see the men eating before she understood the second part of what was wrong. She made do with what she had. She always could. There was a side of salted pork that was still serviceable if you trimmed it aggressively, and she found 4 dozen eggs in the cellar that were fine. She put together a meal that was simple and plain and adequate, which was already better than what the men had apparently been getting, though she didn't know that yet. The hands came in from the range at dusk in the way ranch hands always do, tired in a way that lives below words, dirty quiet. They found their seats at the 2 long tables without ceremony. A few of them glanced at her with open curiosity and knew face a woman, but mostly they were too worn down for anything more than that. She watched them eat. She had developed the habit early, watching people eat. Her mother had taught her that a table told you things. The way a man eats tells you whether he's hungry or merely going through the motions, whether the food is meeting a real need or just filling a space. She had learned to read it, the way a river pilot learns to read the surface of the water not for what's visible, but for what's underneath. What she saw at those 2 long tables that Thursday evening made something in her chest go tight and quiet. These men were not eating with appetite. They were eating with the grim efficiency of people who have learned to expect nothing from a meal beyond the minimum required to keep working. Heads down, jaws moving, eyes somewhere else entirely. One man older with a dark beard and hands that looked like they'd been broken and healed wrong at least twice, ate exactly half his plate, set his fork down, and stared at the wall with the blank expression of someone trying to make their mind go somewhere else. She thought about what she'd found in the kitchen. 27 men, working from before sunrise, eating compromised food for what she suspected was not weeks but months. After supper, she pulled one of the younger hands aside, a boy of maybe 19 with a freckled face and the looks of someone who hadn't yet learned to keep things to himself. His name, she learned, was Danny Fitch, and he'd been at Dust Creek for 8 months. "How long has the food been like this?" she asked. She kept her voice easy and conversational, the way you do when you want an honest answer. Danny looked past her shoulder, old reflex checking to see who might be within earshot. "Always been kind of rough," he said carefully. But lately, he stopped. Shrugged with one shoulder in that way young men do when they want to say something, but haven't decided yet whether to trust the person they're saying it to. A couple of the older boys have had stomach trouble. Nothing that stops them working, but, she knew. "Does anyone say anything to Tanner?" Danny's expression shifted in a way that answered the question before he opened his mouth. "Tanner says we eat what Voss delivers, we're lucky to have it. And if we don't like it, there's men in Amarillo who'd be glad to take our place." He looked down at his boots. He's probably right about that last part. Elena thanked him and let him go. That night, in the small room off the kitchen that came with the position, she sat on the edge of the narrow cot and went through her list again. The numbers didn't add up the way they should. She was not an accountant she'd never claimed to be, but she had grown up in a household where every dollar of food had been tracked against what it actually delivered, and something in how the Dust Creek kitchen was stocked made her feel the same way she felt when a column of figures didn't resolve correctly. Like something was being subtracted somewhere that wasn't on the page. She made herself sleep. She would need to be clear-headed in the morning. The next day she did 2 things before breakfast. She reorganized the kitchen, pulling the compromised goods to one side and making an inventory so precise it would have satisfied her mother, who had been exacting on the subject of inventory. And she could cook breakfast from what she had available: fried corn cakes, with the portion of flour that was still clean, eggs again, and the small amount of serviceable smoked ham she'd found in a cool corner of the cellar. The men came in with the same tired wariness as the evening before. By the time they left, 4 of them had said something to her. Not much. A nod, a quiet word, one older cowboy with a sun-darkened face who paused at the door and said, without looking directly at her, "That's the best breakfast we've had in about 4 months." He walked out before she could respond. She already knew with a certainty that surprised her only a little that she was going to stay. Even if Tanner made it difficult. Even if the situation was more complicated than a bad flour barrel and a careless supplier. She just didn't know yet how much more complicated it was going to get. She went to Tanner that afternoon. Roy Tanner occupied the ranch manager's office like a man who had grown into the space so completely that removing him would require structural renovation. He was broad through the shoulders, somewhere in his late 40s, with the reddened skin of a man who had spent years outdoors followed by years inside a room with a good fire and too much whiskey. He was not unintelligent, she could see that immediately, which made what came next more deliberate than she'd hoped. She laid her list on the desk in front of him. She walked him through it methodically. The weevilled flour, the improperly cured beef, the split bean sacks that had been badly remended, the moisture damage to the salt. She told him what she estimated the delivery weight should have been versus what she'd actually measured when she checked the remaining stock. Tanner looked at the list. He looked at it for long enough that she knew he understood it. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at her. Voss Trading has been supplying this ranch for 11 years, he said. I understand that, Elena said. Harlan Voss is a businessman with a reputation in this region. Mr. Tanner, I can show you the flour barrel. I can show you the beef side that came in last Tuesday. The smell alone, lady. His voice was quiet and flat. I don't know what arrangement you had at your last position, or what you think your role is here. But your job is to take what Voss delivers and turn it into meals. That's the whole of it. She looked at him evenly. My job is to feed 27 men who are doing hard physical labor. If the food they're being given isn't adequate to that task, then that's a concern for the ranch management to address, not the cook. She stood there for a moment. The muscles in her jaw moved once and she made herself relax it. I'd like to request that the next delivery be inspected before it's accepted, she said. Request noted. He turned back to the papers on his desk. Was there anything else? There was not. She left. That evening she cooked supper with what she had, which was not much, but she managed it. She had a talent for making something reasonable out of inadequate materials, and she applied it in full that night, because she was furious, and when Elena Whitmore was furious, she worked harder, not less. The meal she put on the table was not spectacular, but it was clean and solid, and she had made it with what she had available without cutting a single corner. After the men had cleared out, she stayed in the kitchen and began to think. She thought about what Tanner had said and what he had not said. She thought about a supplier with 11 years of uninterrupted access to a ranch and no one checking delivery weights. She thought about a ranch manager who had looked at her list and then told her it wasn't her concern. She thought about the older man with the broken hands, who had left half his supper on his plate, and Danny Fitch looking over his shoulder before he answered a simple question. She thought about the fact that Voss Trading was not probably a charity operation. If Harlan Voss had been delivering compromised goods for any extended period, the difference between the price charged and the value delivered was going somewhere. And if Tanner had reviewed that list and declined to act on it, the question of where it was going had an increasingly obvious answer. She needed to be careful. She also needed to stop accepting the situation as fixed. Over the next 2 days, she began to make changes, not dramatic ones, not the kind that would draw immediate attention, but the kind that accumulate into something visible. She reorganized the storage system so that all incoming deliveries would have to pass through her kitchen before being shelved. She started keeping her own written record of everything that arrived: date, quantity, condition. She kept it in a small notebook she carried in her apron pocket. She also started paying attention to the men. She learned their names faster than most people would have. Not as a social project, she was not particularly social by nature, but because understanding the crew was essential to understanding the ranch, and understanding the ranch was the only way she was going to figure out what was actually happening here. She learned who had been at Dust Creek longest, which men had other options, and which had none, who Tanner listened to, and who Tanner ignored. It was on the third day that she first noticed Colton Rourke. He was not easy to miss exactly, but he was the kind of person who occupied space without drawing attention to it. Medium height, lean, with the economy of movement that comes from physical labor done over a long time rather than deliberate cultivation. Dark hair a few years older than her. He said almost nothing at meals. He worked, from what she could observe, with a quiet efficiency that the other hands seemed to take, as a matter of course, the kind of competence that gets noticed less because it's never absent. What she noticed about him specifically was that he watched, not in an unsettling way, not with the look of someone cataloging weakness, but with the attention of a person who had learned that the important information in most situations is not what they'll say but what they do when they think no one is paying attention. He was watching her. She understood eventually, and she was watching him back. They did not speak directly until the fourth morning. She was in the kitchen before dawn. She was always in the kitchen before dawn, which was partly by necessity and partly because she had never slept, well past 4 in the morning, regardless of what time she'd gone to bed. She was working through the list of what she needed to do with the supplies she had available to produce 3 decent meals for 27 men. She heard the kitchen door open behind her. She turned. expecting Danny Fitch, who had taken to stopping in early on the pretext of picking up a second cup of coffee before heading out to the range. It was Colton Rourke. He stood in the doorway for a moment. His hat was already on, his jacket buttoned. He looked at the counter where she had her supplies laid out and her notebook open. "You're checking quantities," he said, "not a question." She turned back to what she was doing. "I'm doing my job." A short pause. "What's the discrepancy on the beef side?" he asked. She stopped, set down the pencil, turned to look at him fully. "Why do you ask that?" He met her eyes without any particular expression. "Because you've been weighing things since you got here, and the last delivery from Voss was 16 crates short of what the invoice said." She was quiet for a long moment. "How do you know what the invoice said?" He didn't answer that directly. What he said instead was, "You went to Tanner." "Yes." "And he told you it wasn't your concern." "Yes." He nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already worked out. "Be careful," he said. And then he poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the back of the stove, the first time she'd seen any of the hands simply walk into the kitchen and help themselves. But he did it with such a matter-of-fact ease that she found herself not objecting, and he walked out. She stood there with her pencil in her hand. She did not know what to make of Colton Rourke. She did not know why a working ranch hand would know what the Voss delivery invoice said. She did not know why he would warn her to be careful rather than telling her to drop it, the way Tanner had. What she knew was that the warning had been real. She could hear it in the flatness of his voice, not the flatness of someone being dismissive, but the flatness of someone who had already thought through the situation, past the point most people reach, and was telling her something he meant. She picked up her pencil and went back to work. 3 days later, Tanner told her to pack her things by morning. She had gone to him with a delivery receipt, the one that had come in that afternoon, with the new flour shipment. She had weighed the shipment herself, keeping Danny Fitch and one of the older hands named Garrett Willis as witnesses, and the weight was 11 pounds short of what the receipt stated. The flour that was present was again contaminated. She had documented it. She had written it down in her notebook with the date and both witnesses' names. She put the notebook on Tanner's desk next to the delivery receipt and walked him through it. His expression did not change. "Pack your things by morning," he said, "or learn to cook what you're given." She looked at him for a long moment. The room was very quiet. The fire in the small stove near the corner was burning low. "No," she said. Tanner looked up from his desk with an expression that said plainly that he had not expected that word. "Excuse me?" "No," she said again. Her voice was steady. Not loud, not hard, just completely, totally level. "I was hired to cook for this crew. I have not failed to do that. I'm going to continue to do that. If you want to fire me, you'll need to put it in writing and send it to Everett Caldwell's office in Abilene, because that's who I understand to be the actual owner of this ranch, and I'd like it on record why I was dismissed." The silence in that office was the kind that had weight. Tanner's jaw moved once. "You'll regret making this difficult," he said. "Possibly," she said. "But you'll have to fire me properly if you want me gone." She picked up her notebook, left the delivery receipt where it was, and walked out. Her hands were not entirely steady as she walked back across the yard toward the kitchen. She noted that with a kind of detached interest the way your body reacts to something your mind has already decided. She pressed her fingers together and breathed through it. She had bought herself some time. Tanner would not fire her without Caldwell's involvement. Not now that she'd named him. Firing her would draw Caldwell's attention to the ranch, which was clearly something Tanner wanted to avoid, which told her in turn that Tanner had reasons to want Caldwell's attention directed elsewhere. That told her something else entirely. She stepped back into the kitchen and put her notebook on the counter. Colton Rourke was standing by the stove, refilling his coffee cup. She stared at him. "Do you live in my kitchen?" Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "I heard Tanner tell you to pack," he said. "I'm not packing, I know." He set the coffee pot back on the stove. "I wanted to make sure you knew I knew." She looked at him for a long moment, this quiet, watchful cowboy who knew what was on delivery invoices, who warned her to be careful, who walked into her kitchen at odd hours, with the ease of someone completely comfortable in a space that wasn't his. "Who are you?" she said. She didn't mean it as a challenge. She meant it as a genuine question. He looked at her. "Right now," he said, "I'm just a cowboy who thinks you're doing the right thing and who doesn't want to see it go sideways." He set down his cup. "Get some sleep, Miss Whitmore. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." He walked out. She stood there alone in the kitchen, the fire burning low in the stove, the night quiet outside the single east-facing window. She thought about Tanner's face when she'd refused to go. She thought about Voss and his invoices and his 11 years of uninterrupted access. She thought about 27 men eating bad food in tired silence and a ranch manager who looked at evidence and called it none of her concern. And she thought about Colton Rourke, who had walked into this kitchen 3 times in 4 days, and watched her with the patient, careful attention of a man who was waiting to see what she would do next. She picked up her pencil. She opened her notebook to a new page. She wrote the date at the top. She wrote down everything she'd documented. She wrote down what she needed to write to Everett Caldwell's office in Abilene and what she intended to include when she sent it. She worked until the fire burned down to coals and the kitchen went dark, except for the thin, gray beginning of the next morning, showing at the edge of the window. She was not finished. She was not close to finished. She sent the letter to Abilene on a Saturday. She had written it 3 times before she was satisfied with it, not because she was uncertain about what she wanted to say, but because she needed it to be precise. The kind of precise that doesn't give a reader room to dismiss it as complaint or emotion. She laid out the delivery discrepancies in plain figures. She described the condition of the goods in language that was factual and specific. She included both dates and witness names. She did not editorialize. She did not say Tanner was corrupt. She said only that the concerns she had raised with the ranch manager had been declined and that she was bringing them to the owner's attention because she believed Mr. Caldwell would want to know what his kitchen record showed. She sealed the envelope herself and gave it to the Dust Creek rider who made the weekly mail run into town on Saturday mornings. She did not tell Tanner she had done it. She told no one. That same afternoon, a wagon came through the ranch gate with Harlan Voss sitting up on the box seat. Elena had not seen Voss before. She had known his name for 10 days by that point, had written it in her notebook more times than she could easily count. But the man himself was new to her. She watched him from the kitchen doorway as he climbed down from the wagon with the unhurried ease of someone accustomed to arriving places and being received as expected. He was not what she had pictured. She had constructed a mental image of Harlan Voss that involved something meaner in the face, something more obviously dangerous. The actual man was somewhere in his mid-50s, well-dressed in the particular way of someone who wants you to notice the quality of the fabric, with a broad, open face and the practiced warmth of a man who had spent decades making people feel at ease before he asked them for something. He shook Tanner's hand with both of his. He laughed at something, Tanner said. He looked around the ranch yard with the proprietary ease of someone taking inventory of a property he half owned, and then his eyes moved to the kitchen doorway. He saw her standing there. He smiled. It was a good smile. She had no doubt it had served him well. She did not smile back. She went inside and started supper. He came to find her 20 minutes later. She heard his boots on the kitchen floor and turned around with a towel over her shoulder and a wooden spoon in her hand, which she had not planned but which she understood, in retrospect, had been exactly the right posture to be in. "You must be the new cook," he said. "Elena Whitmore," she said. "Harlan Voss." He looked around the kitchen with a practiced, appreciative expression. "Looks like you've been making some changes in here." "I reorganized the storage," she said. "Standard procedure in any kitchen." Of course, of course." He moved along the shelving with the easy familiarity of a man walking through a room he's been in 100 times. "Roy tells me you've had some concerns about the deliveries." She kept her eyes on the stove. "I raised some questions about delivery weights and product condition." "And that's exactly the right thing to do," Voss said, with the warmth of a man agreeing with you in a way that says nothing. "That's exactly what I'd want from anyone managing a kitchen on this level. You let me know if there's ever a problem with any delivery, and I'll see to it personally." She turned around then and looked at him directly. "The flour delivery on Tuesday the 14th was 11 pounds short of the invoiced weight," she said. "The product itself had visible insect damage. I have it documented." Something very small moved in Voss's expression. It was there and gone so fast she might have missed it if she hadn't been watching for it. "Well," he said pleasantly, "that's exactly the kind of thing I want to know about. Weights can vary in transit moisture settling. But I'll review our packing process personally." "The beef side delivered the Tuesday, before that had begun to turn," she said. "I can describe the specific characteristics if that's useful, Miss Whitmore." His voice was still warm, still pleasant. But something had shifted underneath it, the way the temperature of a room shifts before a storm that hasn't arrived yet. "I've been supplying quality goods to ranches in this region for over a decade. My customers have always been satisfied. I'm sure they have," she said. The pause between them was brief and completely clear. "I'm glad we had this conversation," Voss said. He nodded at her once, the same kind of nod Briggs had given her when he left, but with none of the honest resignation. This one had an edge to it that she felt long after he'd walked out of the kitchen. She stood at the stove and listened to the sound of his boots on the yard and the low murmur of his and Tanner's voices through the wall. She could not make out what they were saying. She did not need to. What she had just done was put Harlan Voss on notice that someone at Dust Creek Ranch was keeping records. She had done it deliberately and with a clear understanding that it would not make her safer. She stirred the pot on the stove and thought about what came next. The next morning she noticed 2 things had changed. The first was that Tanner had started coming to the kitchen doorway at odd intervals, not coming in, not saying anything, just pausing there and looking. She filed that away without reacting to it. The second was that 3 of the younger hands, men who had been relatively easy in her presence during the first week, now averted their eyes when she came near and found reasons to be elsewhere at meals. She thought about what Voss might have said to Tanner before he left. She thought about what Tanner might have said to the crew. She kept cooking. What she noticed beneath those 2 changes was something she had not expected. The older hands, the men who had been at Dust Creek longest, who had the most deeply written wariness, had begun to come to the kitchen differently. Garrett Willis, the one who had told her that Thursday breakfast was the best they'd had in 4 months, now picked up his plate with something in his face that was not quite ease, but was also not the grim resignation she'd seen when she first arrived. Old Heck Darden, who was somewhere north of 60, and had the look of a man who had given up expecting things to improve, started sitting at the end of the table nearest the stove closer to where she worked. She noticed, though she did not point this out, Danny Fitch had stopped checking over his shoulder when he talked to her. It was subtle, it was not a revolution, but she had learned from her mother that the way a kitchen runs is the way a house runs, and a house runs on small adjustments made every single day. The men were eating better food. Their bodies knew it even when their minds were still waiting to be convinced. She was carefully working through what she needed for the week's menu, stretching what was serviceable, supplementing with what she'd managed to source through her own contacts in the nearest town, a dry goods store 15 miles east run by a woman named Clara Bates, who had been perfectly willing to sell to Elena directly when Elena explained the situation with professional frankness when Colton Rourke came through the kitchen door on a Tuesday morning. He did not pour himself coffee this time. He sat down on the bench near the prep counter with the direct intention of someone who has decided to have a conversation rather than circle one. "You sent a letter to Caldwell," he said. She looked at him over her shoulder. "How do you know that?" The Saturday writer mentioned it. She turned back to what she was doing. "Then you know I sent a letter to Caldwell." "What did you tell him?" "The same thing I told Tanner, except I included the witness names and the delivery dates." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him thinking. "Voss is going to find out," he said. "Voss already knows something's changed. He came here in person, I know." I saw another pause. "You didn't back down." "No, he's not used to that." She set down what she was working with and turned around fully, leaning back against the prep counter with her arms crossed, not defensively, just because she was tired of talking to the wall. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "I have documented evidence of systematic delivery fraud against this ranch. The ranch manager is either involved or too compromised to act on it. I sent that evidence to the man who owns the ranch because he has the right to know what's being done with his money. If Harlan Voss finds that threatening, that's because it is." Colton looked at her for a long moment. "You're right," he said simply. "I just want to make sure you understand what you're doing." "I understand what I'm doing. Voss has a network," he said. "Tanner doesn't work alone. You need to know that." She studied him. His voice was flat and factual, the way it always was, not dramatic, not trying to scare her into backing down, just telling her something she needed to know. "What kind of network?" she asked. "Business connections. People who owe him. A few who are afraid of him." He looked at the table. "He's had this arrangement running long enough that there are a lot of people who benefit from it staying in place, including Tanner." He looked up at her. "Including Tanner." She nodded slowly. She had already worked that out. But hearing it stated plainly by someone who had reason to know gave it a different weight. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. He was quiet for a beat, the kind of quiet that's a real pause rather than a stalling one. "Because you're the first person in 8 months who's actually looked at this squarely and done something about it," he said. "And I don't want to watch that go sideways because you didn't have enough information." 8 months. She filed that number away. It told her more about how long Colton Rourke had been watching this situation than about how long the situation itself had existed. "All right," she said. "Tell me what I need to know." What followed was the most useful 20 minutes she had spent since arriving at Dust Creek. Rourke was not forthcoming exactly, but he was specific when he spoke, and she had learned that specificity from a reluctant source was worth more than fluency from a willing one. He told her that Voss's relationship with Tanner was old, predating Caldwell's ownership of Dust Creek by at least 3 years, and that Tanner received a monthly supplement from Voss that was not recorded in any of the ranch's books. He told her that 2 other ranches in the region had experienced similar delivery problems in the last 2 years, and that both of them had eventually replaced their cooks or managers rather than their supplier. He told her that Voss was currently in negotiation with a cattle buyer named Gideon Shaw, who had the resources to significantly expand Voss's operation if the deal closed, which meant Voss had particular interest right now in nothing disrupting his reputation or his supply chain. He did not tell her how he knew any of this. She did not ask. Not yet, the men, she said when he'd finished the crew. How many of them know what's actually going on? He thought about that honestly, which she appreciated. Garrett Willis knows something's wrong. Heck, Darden's been here long enough to have seen the change in the food quality. He knows it didn't happen by accident. Danny Fitch is smart enough that he's probably worked out more than he lets on. He paused. But none of them have talked about it openly. Tanner made it clear early that there's no job security for anyone who makes complaints that reach Caldwell's office. So they're quiet because they're afraid of losing their jobs. Most of them don't have other options. Dust Creek isn't just work for most of these men, it's the roof over their head and the food on their plate. The food on their plate. Elena thought about that for a moment, the particular bitterness of that, and then pushed it aside. All right, she said. She went back to work. He sat there for another minute, finishing nothing because he'd never poured coffee this time, and then stood and left. After he was gone, she stood at the counter for a long moment with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes on the far wall. She had sent the letter to Caldwell. She had put Voss on notice. She had found out that Tanner's arrangement with Voss was older and deeper than she'd initially estimated, and that Voss was currently in a particularly sensitive position because of a major business negotiation. She had also understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that Colton Rourke knew far more about Dust Creek Ranch than a working cowhand had any reasonable way of knowing. She filed that alongside the other things she had not yet asked about. The week that followed was the busiest she'd had since arriving, and she had not had a quiet day yet. She expanded her arrangement with Clara Bates in town, negotiating a regular purchase order that gave her reliable access to clean, properly weighted goods that she could supplement the Voss deliveries with, or in some cases replace them entirely when the Voss product was too compromised to use. This cost money, her own money, laid out against the expectation that she could document the expenditure and recoup it through the ranch accounts once Caldwell was in the picture. It was a financial risk she didn't love. She took it anyway. She also began, with careful patience, to change how the kitchen operated in relation to the rest of the ranch. She started accepting small requests from the men not as favors, because favors created imbalance, but as practical accommodations. Garrett Willis had been nursing a bad shoulder for weeks. She had extra liniment in her stores and left a bottle near his usual seat with no comment, and he had picked it up without comment in return. Danny Fitch, who worked the longest shifts of any of the younger hands, started receiving a slightly larger midday meal without being told about it. She paid attention to what the men needed, and she provided it where she could, because she had understood early that a kitchen is not just where food is made, it is one of the few places on a working ranch where the basic fact of being looked after is still possible. By the end of that week, the kitchen had become a different kind of space. She noticed it in the way the men moved through it, less like they were passing through somewhere that tolerated them, more like they were in a room that knew they were there. It was a small change, it mattered. Tanner noticed too. On Thursday of that week, he came into the kitchen at midday when the men were eating and stood near the door, and watched for long enough that the table went quieter than usual. He didn't say anything. He looked at the food on the plates, at the men eating it, at Elena at the stove with her back to him, and then he walked out. She turned around after he'd gone. The table had relaxed again. Garrett Willis was looking at his plate. Danny Fitch was looking at his hands. She served the last of the midday meal and let the quiet settle. That evening, after the kitchen had cleared, she sat at the end of the long table with her notebook and her tallies and a piece of paper on which she was drafting what she intended to say when Caldwell's response arrived, because she was operating on the assumption that it would arrive, that Caldwell was a man who read his correspondence and responded to it, though she understood this was an assumption that might be wrong. The door opened. It was not Colton Rourke this time. It was Garrett Willis. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who has decided to do something uncomfortable and has committed to it. He was somewhere in his mid-50s. She thought it was hard to say, because physical work ages the outside of a person at a different rate than the inside, with the slow, deliberate manner of someone who had spent years in places where speaking carelessly had consequences. "You got a minute," he said. "Sit down," she said. He sat across from her at the long table. He put his hat on the surface in front of him and kept his hands folded over it. "I've been at Dust Creek 11 years, he said. Longer than Tanner." She waited. "Longer than the arrangement with Voss," he said. "I knew what it was when it started. I didn't say anything because I had a family to feed and no place else to go." She looked at him. The candor of it, the plain, uncomfortable honesty, was the kind of thing that was hard to respond to without reducing it. So she didn't respond to it. She waited. "I'm saying that because I want you to understand that I'm not coming here now out of some sudden change of conscience," he said. "I'm coming here because you've been doing something for 2 weeks that I should have done 3 years ago. and I'm not comfortable with that, and I want to do something useful about it. He looked at the hat in his hands. What do you need? She thought about that for a moment. I need witnesses who can confirm what they've observed, she said. Not speculation, what they've personally seen, heard, or measured. Specific, dated if possible. He nodded slowly. I can give you names, he said. Men who've noticed things and kept their mouths shut. Men who'll talk to you if you ask them the right way. Will they put it in writing? A pause, longer this time. Someone will, he said. If they believe Caldwell's actually going to do something about it. I believe he will, she said. Not because she had any particular certainty about Everett Caldwell as a man she had never met him, but because the alternative was a position she declined to occupy. Garrett looked at her for a moment, and something in his face shifted not into ease, because he was not an easy man, but into a kind of grim resolution that was cleaner than the guilty avoidance she'd seen when she first arrived. All right, he said. He gave her 4 names. He told her what each man had seen. He was specific and careful, and he did not embellish, which made her trust him more rather than less. By the time he stood to leave, she had 2 more pages in her notebook and a plan for the following week. She walked him to the kitchen door. He paused on the threshold. Tanner's going to figure out what you're building, he said. I know. He's going to go to Voss. He's probably already talked to Voss. Voss was here last week. Willis looked at her steadily. Voss is going to push back harder than he has, he said. I know that too. He nodded once, put his hat back on his head, and walked out into the dark yard. She stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to his boots cross the packed dirt. Then she went back to her notebook. The following week moved in 2 directions at once, and she felt the pressure of both of them. On one side, the kitchen was working. The food was better, the men were steadier, and the small quiet community that had formed around the long tables at mealtimes had a different quality now, still tired, still rough around the edges, still punctuated by the silences that come from physical exhaustion, but alive in a way it hadn't been when she arrived. 3 of the men Garrett had named had agreed to speak with her privately. 2 of them would put their observations in writing. The deliveries were being documented with enough regularity and precision that she was confident her records would hold up to scrutiny. On the other side, Tanner was watching. The 3 younger hands who had pulled away from her had not come back. She overheard a conversation near the water trough that stopped when she came within range, not dramatically. Just stopped, the way conversations do when the subject of them has arrived. And there were 2 incidents with deliveries that she believed were deliberate. A meat delivery, with quantities so clearly below the invoiced weight that it seemed almost too flagrant to be accidental, as if Voss were testing whether she would escalate or absorb it. She documented both and said nothing to Tanner. She received Caldwell's reply on a Thursday 12 days after she'd sent her letter. It came in a plain envelope with the Abilene postmark, and it was shorter than she'd expected, half a page in a neat, controlled hand that told her immediately that Everett Caldwell was a man who had learned to say things precisely and stop when he'd said them. He acknowledged her letter. He said he had found its contents concerning. He said he intended to visit Dust Creek Ranch in approximately 3 weeks' time, and that he would appreciate her continued documentation in the interim. He asked her to make no major operational changes that might complicate the situation before his arrival. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket. She had 3 weeks. She also had, starting that afternoon, a problem she had not anticipated. The word had reached the bunkhouse, she didn't know exactly how, though she had her suspicions that Elena Whitmore had been corresponding with Everett Caldwell. She didn't know what version of the story had traveled, or who had carried it, but by supper Thursday the atmosphere in the kitchen had changed again, and not entirely in one direction. Garrett Willis ate his supper without looking up. Danny Fitch was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. 3 of the men she had not had much contact with had pulled their seats slightly back from the table, creating a physical distance that was not subtle enough to be accidental. But on the other side of that same table, old Heck Darden sat where he always sat now, at the end nearest the stove, and he looked up when she set the pot down and said, "Good stew, Miss Whitmore," in the flat, straightforward way he had, and went back to eating. She refilled his bowl without being asked. She was finishing the washing up that evening when she heard boots on the floor behind her, and she knew, by the particular sound of them, the even, unhurried tread, that it was Colton Rourke before she turned around. He looked at her for a moment. His face had the quality it always had, direct without performance, giving away less than it knew. "Caldwell wrote back," he said. She looked at him. "You heard that too?" Tanner heard it. He came out of his office at about 4 o'clock looking like a man who'd sat on something. He paused. "Which means Voss is going to hear it by tomorrow." She wiped her hands on the towel over her shoulder. "How long do you think before Voss does something about it?" He thought about that in the honest way he had. "Less than a week," he said. "He can't afford to wait. Not with Caldwell coming. What will he do?" Another pause. He'll try to destabilize the workforce, Rourke said. Tanner will start suggesting there are other positions available. Men who feel uncertain about their future here will start listening. He looked at the table. He's done it before. At the Mercer Ranch 2 years ago. The crew started falling apart 3 weeks before the owner arrived to do his inspection. And by the time Mercer got there, the operation looked unstable enough that he blamed the management and replaced it rather than looking at the supplier. She thought about that. About the men at the table. About Danny Fitch with his freckled face and his sideways glances. About Garrett Willis with 11 years at this ranch and a guilty conscience that had just barely gotten him into her kitchen. Then I need to talk to the men before Voss does, she said. Rourke was quiet. That's a risk, he said. I know. If it goes wrong, Tanner will use it. He'll tell Caldwell you were inciting the crew. Then I need it to not go wrong. She looked at him directly. Will you be there when I do it? He held her gaze for a long moment. Yes, he said. She nodded. The following evening after supper, she did not clear the kitchen. She stood at the end of the long table while the men were still finishing their last cups of coffee, and she spoke to them plainly, not as a speech, not as an address, but as a direct, honest conversation between people who were all dealing with the same situation and deserved to know what it was. She told them what she had found when she arrived. She told them what she had documented. She told them that Caldwell was coming and that he had asked for her records. She did not tell them what to do about any of it. She told them the truth, and she let them sit with it. The kitchen was very quiet. Heck Darden was the first to speak. He set down his cup and said without preamble, "How long before Caldwell gets here?" "About 3 weeks," she said. He nodded, said nothing else. Then Garrett Willis, from the middle of the table, said, "What do you need from us?" She looked at him. Then at the rest of the table, the mix of faces, the varying degrees of weariness and exhaustion, and the thing underneath both that she had been seeing for 2 weeks now, but that was clearer in this moment than it had ever been. These were men who had been quietly enduring something that was being done to them without their consent, and they were tired of it in a way they hadn't had a language for until someone put it plainly. "Just stay," she said. "Stay and do your work. That's all I'm asking." She stepped back to the stove. The kitchen didn't go loud exactly, but it loosened. Men finished their coffee. Conversation started in ones and twos, low-voiced but present. Danny Fitch caught her eye from the far end of the table and gave her the smallest, most careful nod she had ever received from another human being. Colton Rourke, who had stood near the kitchen door through the whole conversation without saying a word, watched all of it with the patient, level attention she had come to recognize as his particular mode of being present in a room. When the men had cleared out, he was still there. She didn't say anything. She started on the dishes. After a long moment, he picked up a towel and began to dry what she washed. They worked in silence for a while. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that two people arrive at together when they've been through something and don't need to talk about it yet. "You're good at that," he said eventually. "At what?" "Telling people hard things without making them feel small." She considered that. "My mother used to say that the way you talk to people in a hard moment is the way they'll remember you when the moment's over." She said that. She wasn't a sentimental woman, but she was right about that. He set a dried pot on the shelf. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," he said. "She was," Elena said. "She died 4 years ago. He didn't fill that with anything. Didn't apologize for it or offer her a platitude about time healing things. He just let it sit there as the real thing it was. And she found, to her faint surprise, that she was grateful for it." They finished the dishes. The fire in the stove had burned to a low, steady heat. Outside the night was quiet, the particular quality of quiet that open country has when the wind drops, and there's nothing between you and the dark in any direction. She put away the last of the pots and turned around to find him still there, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed and his eyes on the middle distance. "Rourke," she said. He looked at her. "I know you know more about this ranch than a working hand should know," she said. Her voice was even. Not accusatory. She had decided a long time ago that accusation was a blunt instrument. "I'm not asking you to explain it tonight, but I want you to know that I've noticed, and that when you're ready to tell me the rest of it, I'm willing to listen." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, not alarm, not discomfort, but the particular quality of expression you get from someone who has been seen clearly and is still deciding what to do about it. "All right," he said quietly. He put the towel over the rack by the door, picked up his hat from the peg, and walked out. Elena stood alone in the kitchen. 3 weeks until Caldwell arrived. A workforce that had just been asked to hold together against a man who had spent 11 years learning how to pull things apart. A ranch manager who would be on a telephone to Voss before morning. And a quiet cowboy who moved through this ranch like he owned it. She looked at her notebook on the counter. at the growing record of dates and weights and witness names that was slowly and methodically becoming something harder to ignore than any of them had been prepared for. She closed the notebook. She put it in her apron pocket. She went to bed, knowing exactly what the next morning would bring. More work, more watching, more of the careful, patient accumulation of evidence that was the only weapon she had ever needed. And underneath that, the feeling she'd learned early not to name too quickly, because naming it made it breakable, something that felt cautiously, like things beginning to shift. The morning after she spoke to the crew, Elena woke before 4 and lay in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the ranch settle around her, the distant sound of horses shifting in the corral, the low creak of the bunkhouse walls contracting in the pre-dawn cold. She had slept badly, not from anxiety exactly, but from the particular alertness that comes when you've put something in motion and can't take it back. She got up dressed and went to the kitchen. She had learned in the last 3 weeks that the kitchen was where she thought most clearly, and she needed to think clearly now. She built the fire in the stove and put the coffee on and stood at the prep counter with her notebook open, going through everything she had, the delivery records, the witness accounts, the 2 written statements she'd received from men who had agreed to sign their names to what they'd seen. She looked at the numbers again, the systematic discrepancy between invoiced weight and delivered weight, the pattern of product condition that was too consistent to be coincidence, and she felt, as she always did when she looked at them in full, the same cold clarity she'd felt the morning she first understood what she was dealing with. It was not complicated, what Voss had been doing. That was almost the worst part of it. It was simple and patient, and it had worked for 11 years, because everyone involved had either been paid to ignore it or had decided that ignoring it was the safest available option. The genius of it, if you could call it that, was that it operated entirely below the level where anyone with authority was paying attention, too small to trigger alarm, too consistent to read as accident, too well insulated by Tanner's management layer for any of it to reach Caldwell's desk in Abilene. Until now, she was still at the counter when Colton Rourke came through the door at 5:15. Earlier than usual. She looked at him. He had the expression of someone carrying news he hadn't decided how to deliver yet. "Sit down," she said, and poured him a cup of coffee. He sat. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the surface of the coffee for a moment. "Voss was at the Tanner house last night," he said. "Late. After the crew was in the bunkhouse, she kept her voice level." "How late?" "Close to 10. He didn't come through the main gate. He came in on the south track." A pause. "The south track isn't used for deliveries." She absorbed that. The south track ran along the back edge of the ranch property. She knew it existed because Danny Fitch had mentioned it once in passing. The route the hands used when they needed to move cattle without coming through the yard. It was not a route you took by accident. How long was he there? An hour, maybe a little more. Rourke looked up at her. "Tanner's been in his office since 7 this morning. He hasn't come out." She thought about what that meant. Voss, coming in the back way after dark, spending an hour with Tanner, and then Tanner spending the following morning in his office with the door closed. "He's planning something," she said. "He's already planning something. The question is what it is." She looked at him. "Do you know?" He turned the coffee cup in his hands once. A habit she'd noticed he did it when he was choosing his words. "I have some idea," he said. "Voss's strongest move right now is the workforce. He can't touch your documentation directly. He doesn't know exactly what you have, or who signed what. He can't go to Caldwell himself without making his own position worse. But if Dust Creek's crew starts falling apart before Caldwell arrives, the ranch looks unstable. Caldwell's a businessman. He sees a ranch that's struggling to keep its hands. He's going to be asking different questions than the ones you want him asking." She had thought of this. She had thought of it in the dark last night when she couldn't sleep. "He'd try to pull men off the ranch," she said. "Offer them work elsewhere. Better pay, easier conditions, immediate start." He nodded. "Some of these men are 1 bad month away from a serious problem. Voss knows that. He's been supplying this ranch long enough to know who's borrowed against their pay, who's got family obligations, who's the most vulnerable." She was quiet for a moment. "Garrett," she said. Rourke's expression confirmed it without him having to say anything. "Willis. 11 years at Dust Creek, a bad shoulder that was getting worse. A daughter in Amarillo he sent money to every month. He had come to her kitchen and told her what he knew and signed his name to it. He was also, she now understood, exactly the kind of man Voss would target, experienced enough that losing him would genuinely hurt the ranch's operations, financially pressured enough that an offer of better pay somewhere else would be genuinely tempting. "When?" she asked. "Could be any day now. Voss doesn't wait once he decides to move." She closed her notebook. The thing about this moment, the thing she understood clearly, as she stood in her kitchen on that particular morning, was that there was no clean play available. She could not offer these men more money than Voss could, because she had no money beyond what she was spending on clean supplies out of her own pocket. She could not guarantee them job security at a ranch whose owner she had never met and whose response to her letter had been encouraging but non-committal. She could not promise them that Caldwell would arrive and fix everything, because she had no real certainty of that. What she had was the truth, and the truth was a limited tool in a situation where people were being offered cash. She understood that. She used it anyway. She made breakfast that morning, with more care than usual, not because she thought food was the answer to what was coming, but because she knew, from 3 weeks of watching, that the men were more themselves at the table after a good meal, less defended, more willing to say what they actually thought. She made biscuits from scratch, which she hadn't done in a week because the time it required wasn't always available, and she made a proper gravy with the last of the decent pork, and she set it on the table while the men were still coming in from the early chores. The response was what she'd learned to watch for the slight shift in posture, the slowing of the eating pace, the sound of conversation starting sooner than it usually did. Small things, real things. She watched Garrett Willis through breakfast. He ate with the same deliberate thoroughness as always, and his face told her nothing. That was not necessarily bad. Garrett was not a man whose face gave much away under any circumstances. But she noticed that he looked up at her once, near the end of the meal, and held her gaze for a second longer than was accidental. She gave him a small nod. He looked back at his plate. 2 days later, Voss made his move. It was not subtle, which surprised her slightly. She had expected something more oblique from a man who had spent 11 years operating in the spaces between clear visibility. But perhaps he was past the point of subtlety. Or perhaps he had calculated that the timeline before Caldwell's arrival was short enough that blunt force was more efficient than finesse. He sent 2 men. They arrived at Dust Creek on a Wednesday afternoon, not in a Voss trading wagon, but in a plain buckboard. 2 men in clean clothes with the professional ease of people sent to deliver a message rather than receive one. She watched them from the kitchen window as they crossed the yard to where a group of the hands were gathered near the water trough after the afternoon's work. She wiped her hands and went outside. She didn't approach them directly. She positioned herself near the tool shed, which was close enough to hear without being close enough to be the obvious subject of whatever conversation was taking place. She watched the 2 men talk to Hector Baines and young Callum Reed, 2 of the hands she had not reached, the ones who had been pulling away since the start, and she watched the expressions on Baines and Reed's faces move through something that was clearly interesting to them. Better pay, easier conditions, immediate start, exactly as Rourke had said. She went back inside. She had known this was coming. She had a plan, or the beginning of one. But standing in her kitchen with the sounds of those 2 men's voices carrying faintly through the wall, she felt the particular sick weight of a situation where someone else is making moves, and you are standing in a room with limited options, trying to decide which of them is the least costly. She called it wrong on her first instinct, which was to do nothing to trust that the conversation she'd had with the crew 2 nights ago had been enough, that the relationships she'd built over 3 weeks would hold against the practical reality of a better offer. She spent approximately 2 hours in that position before she admitted to herself that she was wrong and changed course. It was Heck Darden who helped her see it. He came into the kitchen at mid-afternoon. For his usual cup of coffee, he had developed the habit of stopping in at odd hours, which she had long since stopped questioning, and he sat at the end of the table and said, without preamble, "Baines is thinking hard about it." She turned from the stove. "How do you know?" "Because I know Hector Baines," he said. He wrapped his hands around his cup. "He's got a brother in Lubbock who's been sick. Medicine's expensive. An extra $12 a month would change his situation." $12 a month. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. "And Reed?" she asked. "Callum's young enough that he doesn't have a strong reason to stay anywhere." Darden took a sip of coffee. "The other 2, the ones from Tanner's preferred crew, they'll probably go if Baines goes. Baines has more seniority than Tanner admits, and where he leads, those 2 follow." She thought about that. "What about the others?" Darden was quiet for a moment. He was the oldest man on the crew by a visible margin, with the slow deliberateness of someone who had survived a long time by being careful about what he said. "Most of the others will stay," he said. "Garrett will stay. Danny will stay. The rest of the old crew," he paused. "I think so. But if they watch Baines leave and nothing happens, they're going to start wondering." She understood what he was telling her. Not just that Baines might leave, but that his leaving would be a signal that in a crew that had been living with uncertainty for months, watching someone walk away without visible consequence would start a conversation that was much harder to manage than the one she'd already had. She put down the spoon she was holding. "I need to talk to Baines," she said. Darden looked at her. "He's a proud man, Miss Whitmore. He won't take kindly to being handled." I'm not going to handle him, she said. I'm going to tell him the truth. She found Hector Baines in the far corral at the end of his afternoon work. A lean, sun-dark man in his early 40s with a precise, economical way of moving that reminded her of someone who had learned to conserve energy across very long days. He looked up when she approached and waited with the expression of a man who had been expecting this conversation and hadn't decided yet how he wanted it to go. She didn't lead with the ranch. She didn't lead with Caldwell or Voss or the records she'd been keeping. She said, without preamble, I heard your brother's been ill. Something moved across Baines's face, a flicker of surprise, quickly controlled. Where'd you hear that? He said. Darden mentioned it. Not as a criticism, just as information. He was quiet. He looked at the horse he'd been working with and then back at her. He's been sick since March, he said. Fever that won't quite clear. I'm sorry, she said. And she meant it, which he apparently heard because some of the careful flatness in his expression shifted slightly. The offer those men brought, she said. $12 more a month. 13, he said. She absorbed that 13. And they said the position was steady. No uncertainty about who's managing what. She looked at him directly. I can't match that money, she said. I want to be honest with you. I don't have it. What I have is documentation that shows Caldwell has been losing more than double that per month per man in compromised goods, and a letter from Caldwell himself saying he's coming to address it. She paused. I believe that when he arrives and reviews what we have, the situation at this ranch changes significantly. But I can't promise you that. And if you need that money now for your brother, I understand that that might be the most important thing. He looked at her for a long moment. Why are you telling me this instead of trying to talk me out of leaving? He said. Because you're a grown man and the decision is yours, she said. But I wanted you to have the full picture rather than just the one that was handed to you this afternoon by two men Voss sent. Something shifted in his face again. More substantially this time. Voss sent them, he said. Yes. He looked at the ground. She watched him process it, the calculation of it, the thing it meant about what kind of offer it actually was and where it was actually coming from. If I stay, he said slowly, and Caldwell arrives and doesn't do anything, then you've lost a better paying position at another ranch, she said. That's the real risk. I won't pretend otherwise. He was quiet for a long moment. When's Caldwell coming? About 2.5 weeks, she said. He looked up at the sky, not dramatically. Just the look of a man thinking through arithmetic. All right, he said finally. I'll stay. She felt something loosen in her chest. She did not show it. Thank you, she said. She walked back across the yard with the flat, deliberate pace she had taught herself when she was 22 and first learning that letting relief show on your face in difficult situations was a form of information you couldn't always afford to give. She was almost at the kitchen door when Callum Reed caught up with her. He fell into step beside her, young, earnest, slightly breathless from having jogged across the yard. I heard you talk to Baines, he said. She looked at him. I did. Is he staying? Yes. He was quiet for a few steps. She waited. I'm staying too, he said. Then, with the slightly defensive quality of young men, when they're doing something they're not entirely certain about, not because of anything. I think what you're doing is the right thing. She stopped walking and looked at him. He was maybe 20 years old, with a face that still had the open, unguarded quality that the ranch would probably close down in another few years. He looked back at her with a directness that she found in that moment unexpectedly moving. I appreciate that, she said simply. He nodded. He walked away quickly, the way young people do when they've said a real thing and need to put some distance between themselves and it. She went inside. That evening she told Rourke what had happened. He was in the kitchen again. By this point she had simply accepted that Colton Rourke spent a significant portion of his off hours in her kitchen, and she had stopped analyzing it because there were more pressing things to analyze. He listened to the account of both conversations without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Baines is the one that matters, he said. He holds on and the others hold on. That's what Darden said. Darden's been right about everything he's told you so far. She looked at him. There was something in his voice, not admiration exactly, but a kind of approval that was not about her and was not sentimental, just the clean recognition of something done well. Voss is going to find out they didn't go, she said. Probably by tomorrow. Probably by tonight, Rourke said. His men would have reported in by now. She thought about what came next. She was building the picture of it in her mind. Voss, receiving the news that his move had failed, deciding what to do about it. A man with 11 years of practice and a major business negotiation currently in progress, being outmaneuvered by a cook who had been at the ranch for less than a month. He's going to file a complaint, Rourke said, as if he'd been following the same line of thought. She looked at him sharply. With whom? Caldwell's office in Abilene. Maybe the county commissioner, depending on what angle he uses. He met her eyes. He'll frame it as mismanagement. Say you've been disrupting the crew's relationship with ranch management, interfering with established supply contracts. Maybe suggest the documentation you've been keeping is exaggerated or fabricated. She felt a cold, clean anger move through her. Not the hot kind was useful only for getting out of a room. The cold kind was what you needed when you were building something that had to hold. I need to send everything I have to Caldwell before Voss does, she said. Yes, tonight, he nodded. I'll arrange for a rider. She stopped, looked at him. A working ranch hand, arranging a private rider to Abilene, at night, on 2 hours' notice. Rourke, she said. He looked at her. Who are you, she said. The same question she had asked him 3 weeks ago, in almost the same spot in the kitchen, with almost the same tone. This time he didn't deflect. He looked at her for a long, still moment, long enough that she understood the decision being made, and then he said, Sit down, Elena. It was the first time he had used her first name. She sat. He sat across from her. He put both hands flat on the table, which she had noticed was something he did when he was going to say something that mattered. I own 1/3 of Dust Creek Ranch, he said. The kitchen was completely quiet. Caldwell brought me in as a silent partner 18 months ago, he continued. He'd been having operational problems. He's a good businessman, but he manages his properties from Abilene, and he knew something was wrong here. He couldn't get a clear picture from Tanner. So he asked me to come in without identifying myself. He looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. I've been here 8 months. I've been building a picture of what Voss and Tanner have been running, but I didn't have documentation that would survive a legal challenge. What you've built in less than a month is more solid than anything I had. She looked at him. She was aware of several things happening simultaneously in her mind, the pieces reorganizing. The things he had done and said for acquiring new context. The questions she now needed to ask, shifting into an entirely different register. You knew about Voss when I arrived, she said. Yes. You let me walk into it. I didn't let you do anything, he said, and his voice was direct without being defensive. You walked in and started looking. I watched to see if you'd stop when it got difficult. A pause. You didn't. She thought about that. She decided not to be angry about it, not because she wasn't entitled to the feeling, but because anger at this particular moment would cost her more than it gave her, and she had learned to be selective about what she spent. The letter I sent to Caldwell, she said. He wrote to me the same day he wrote to you. He told me to watch your back. He knew I didn't know who you were. Yes. She looked at the table for a moment. The fire in the stove was burning low. Outside, the ranch had gone quiet with the settling quiet of late evening, the specific silence of a place where everyone had gone to bed, except the people who were still awake because something was happening. The rider to Abilene, she said. I can have someone at the south gate in 2 hours. He paused. Everything you have. Copies of the delivery records, the witness statements, the dated notes. All of it, she looked at him. You should have told me sooner, she said. Yes, he said simply. I should have. She appreciated that he didn't try to justify it further. She stood, went to the shelf where she kept her working notebook and the folder of documents she had been adding to since the first week, and she spent the next 40 minutes making careful copies of everything: dates, figures, names, the signed statements from Garrett Willis and Del Ostrander, the full log of every delivery since her arrival cross-referenced against the invoices she had carefully collected. When she was finished, she sealed the package and handed it to Rourke. He looked at her for a moment. I know this doesn't make everything easier, he said. It makes some things easier, she said, and some things more complicated. He nodded. He understood what she meant, she thought, though they didn't say it out loud. The particular complication of realizing that the man you'd been watching with cautious, careful attention across 3 weeks of difficult mornings was not what he had appeared to be, and that what he actually was changed the mathematics of a number of things she had been deliberately not thinking about. He left with the package. She stayed in the kitchen and started on the breakfast prep for the following morning. She was 3 days away from the moment when everything changed, though she didn't know the timing yet. She knew the shape of what was coming. Voss's complaint would arrive in Abilene. Caldwell would receive it alongside everything she had just sent. The question was which set of information would define what Caldwell saw when he arrived, the picture Voss wanted him to see, or the picture her records made. She also knew now that Colton Rourke's silent partner, wealthy landowner, the man who had been walking into her kitchen and drying her dishes and warning her about things he had no business knowing, was going to be standing somewhere in that room when Caldwell arrived. And that changed everything about what that moment would look like. She didn't let herself think about all of it. She cut it down to the size she could manage the next 3 days. The crew holding together, the documentation in Caldwell's hands before Voss's version of events arrived. It was 2 mornings later before full light when the first real blow landed. She was at the stove when she heard boots on the porch, not the careful, even tread she had come to know. but something faster, less controlled. Danny Fitch came through the door with the particular breathless quality of someone who has been running. Voss filed a complaint, he said. Tanner posted it on the bunkhouse door this morning. She turned from the stove. What does it say? It says you've been inciting the crew against the management. It says you've been keeping unauthorized records and interfering with established supplier contracts. He stopped, swallowed. It says you're going to be dismissed before Caldwell gets here. She looked at him steadily. Tanner has the authority to dismiss me without Caldwell's approval, she asked. He's saying he does. She thought about that for a moment, about the legal question of it, about whether Tanner actually had that authority or was bluffing, about whether it mattered in practical terms, because even a wrongful dismissal would disrupt everything she had been building. She thought about Colton Rourke, silent partner, 1/3 owner. Go get Garrett, she said. Danny went. She turned back to the stove and finished the biscuits that were already in the oven, because 27 men still needed breakfast regardless of what was happening in the ranch office, and because the discipline of finishing what you started was the only thing she trusted herself completely in that moment. Garrett came in 5 minutes later, hat in hand, face set with the look of a man who had seen the notice and understood what it meant. Tanner's going to call you in after breakfast, Garrett said. He's going to make it official, let him, she said. Garrett looked at her. Elena. Let him make it official, she said again. Her voice was very calm. When he does, I want you and Darden and Baines in the yard. Not interfering, just present. I want witnesses. He held her gaze. What are you going to do? She took the biscuits out of the oven. I'm going to let Tanner say what he's going to say, she said. And then I'm going to ask Colton Rourke to say what he has to say. Garrett went very still. She looked at him. His face had the expression of a man rearranging his understanding of something. You know, he said. Not a question. I know, she said. A long pause. For how long, he asked. 3 days, she said. Maybe I should have worked it out sooner. But I got there. Garrett Willis stood in her kitchen with his hat in his hands and his 11 years of quiet, guilty survival on his face. And he looked at her with something she had not seen from him before, not just respect, which she had earned over weeks of hard work, but the particular kind of regard you develop for someone who has been playing a harder game than you realized and winning it with less. All right, he said. She plated the biscuits. She rang the bell for breakfast. The crew came in. They ate. The kitchen was fuller of a particular kind of quiet that is different from comfortable silence, the quiet of people who feel something building and are not sure whether to brace for it or lean toward it. After the last cup of coffee was poured and the last plate was cleared, Roy Tanner came through the kitchen door. He had the formal, overcomposed expression of a man who has decided he is in the right and needs his face to agree with him. Miss Whitmore, he said, I need you to come to the office. All right, she said. She untied her apron and set it on the counter. She walked with him across the yard in the early morning light, and she noticed, without turning around, that Garrett Willis and Heck Darden and Hector Baines had drifted out of the kitchen behind her and positioned themselves near the fence that ran along the office side of the yard, not following, not interfering, just present, the way she'd asked. She also noticed, coming from the direction of the bunkhouse, the unhurried, even tread of Colton Rourke walking toward them. Tanner noticed too. He stopped walking, he turned. His face went through several expressions in quick succession. Rourke stopped a few feet away. He looked at Tanner with the same flat, patient attention he brought to everything. He said, the word landed the way it did because of how it was said, not a greeting, not a challenge, just a man saying another man's first name with the particular weight of someone who does not need to raise his voice to make his position clear. Tanner looked at him, then at Elena, then back at Rourke. You told her, he said. She worked it out, Rourke said. Tanner's jaw moved. Something behind his eyes had the quality of a calculation going wrong, not panic, but the specific look of a man whose plan has hit a structural problem he hadn't accounted for. You can't stop the dismissal, Tanner said. The complaint's already filed. Caldwell has her documentation, Rourke said. All of it. He received it 2 days ago. He also has my assessment of the situation, which I sent with it. He held Tanner's gaze without difficulty. The complaint Voss filed went to Caldwell's office this morning. Caldwell's office already has everything he needs to evaluate it. The yard was very quiet. Garrett Willis, near the fence, had his arms crossed. Heck Darden was looking at the ground. Hector Baines was watching Tanner, with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is not going back on it. Danny Fitch was standing near the kitchen door, with his freckled face open and startled, and Elena would remember later, when she thought about this particular moment, that Danny looked like someone watching the ending of something, not dramatically, not triumphantly, but with the specific quality of relief that arrives after a long time of not being sure whether things were going to be all right. Tanner looked at all of them. He looked at Elena. He looked at Rourke. He went back into his office and shut the door. She stood in the yard in the morning light. Her hands were steady. The cold anger from 2 nights ago had resolved into something quieter and more durable, not victory. Because nothing was resolved yet, and Caldwell had not arrived, and there was still 2.5 weeks of managing what came next. But something. Rourke came to stand beside her. Not close, just beside her, in the companionable way of two people who have been through something together, and are now standing in the aftermath of it, in the clear morning air. He'll stay in the office for a while, Rourke said quietly. Let him, she said. A pause. Caldwell's moving up his visit, Rourke said. He wired me this morning. He'll be here in 4 days. She looked at him. 4 days. The timeline had just compressed into something she could feel in her chest. How much of what I've built will hold up to his inspection, she asked. All of it, Rourke said, every piece of it. She looked at the office door, then at the kitchen, then at the crew, Garrett and Darden and Baines near the fence, Danny at the door, the others filtering out of the bunkhouse with the morning's work ahead of them. 27 men, better fed, steadier, still here. 4 days, she said. 4 days, he confirmed. She went back to the kitchen. 4 days. She wrote it at the top of a clean page in her notebook that morning, and then stared at it for a moment before she started the list beneath it. 4 days to make sure every document was in order. Every figure was cross-referenced. Every witness account was accurate and signed and dated. 4 days to keep 27 men fed and working and steady while Tanner sat in his office, and Voss waited somewhere off the ranch for news that his complaint had done what he'd intended it to do. 4 days to make Dust Creek Ranch look like what it actually was, rather than what Roy Tanner had been allowing it to look like for the better part of 3 years. She did not waste any of them. The morning after the confrontation in the yard, Tanner came out of his office at 8 o'clock with the deliberate composure of a man who has spent the night reorganizing his position and has settled on a strategy. He did not speak to Elena. He spoke to 3 of the hands about the day's work assignments, adjusted the afternoon's cattle schedule, and conducted himself throughout with the performance of a ranch manager going about ordinary business. If you hadn't been watching closely, if you hadn't seen the particular quality of a man managing his own face, you might have thought nothing had happened the day before. Elena watched closely. She thought, he's decided to act as though nothing has changed until Caldwell arrives, at which point he'll argue that the situation is under control, that she overstepped, and that Voss's complaint reflects a reasonable business concern from a long-standing supplier who felt undermined by an unauthorized operational change. It was not a bad strategy. Tanner was not a stupid man. He had survived 11 years in this position by being able to read what people wanted to hear and providing it, and he had spent those years insulated from Caldwell's direct oversight by the simple geography of Abilene. He would put his version of events on the table as steadily and reasonably as he could, and he would let Caldwell decide between 2 competing accounts. The problem for Tanner was that one of those accounts had numbers in it. She spent the morning going through her documentation with the kind of attention she usually reserved for the most difficult kitchen problems, the ones where the margin for error was very small and the cost of being wrong was high. She organized everything chronologically and cross-referenced the delivery records against her own supply expenditures, the money she had spent out of pocket at Clara Bates's dry goods store, which she had kept receipts for, every single one. The difference between what Voss had been charging the ranch and what she had been paying for equivalent clean goods was significant. Significant enough that laid out in a column of figures, it told a story that didn't require much interpretation. She also went through the witness statements again. She had 2 signed accounts, Garrett Willis and Del Ostrander, the quiet, steady hand she'd spoken to in the 3rd week. She had 4 additional accounts documented in her own hand, attributed to named individuals with dates. She thought about whether she needed more, and decided that what she had was better served by being precise than comprehensive too many accounts, and a sharp attorney could find inconsistencies. What she had was tight and specific, and she intended to keep it that way. On the 2nd day, Colton Rourke came to the kitchen in the early afternoon, which was unusual. His kitchen visits had mostly been mornings and evenings, fitting around the work schedule of a man who was, whatever else he was, genuinely doing the physical labor of a ranch hand alongside everything else. He looked tired. She hadn't seen him look tired before. Not the tired of physical work, which she understood, but the specific drain of someone who has been carrying 2 things at once for a long time, and is near the point where one of them is going to have to be set down. Caldwell's bringing someone with him, he said. She set down what she was working with and turned around. Who? Gideon Shaw. She had heard that name from Rourke 3 weeks ago. The cattle buyer Voss was currently negotiating with for the expansion deal. The one who had the resources to significantly change Voss's operation if the deal closed. Why is Caldwell bringing Shaw? She said. Because Caldwell is a man who thinks 3 steps ahead, Rourke said. He sat down with the ease of someone whose body has decided to sit down regardless of whether the mind has given permission. Shaw is interested in long-term supply contracts with ranches in this region. If Dust Creek's operation impresses him, it's a significant financial benefit for the ranch independent of anything we're dealing with Voss. She looked at him for a moment. Caldwell's bringing a cattle buyer to inspect a ranch that has been in operational chaos for the last month, she said. Caldwell's bringing a cattle buyer to inspect a ranch that has been in the process of fixing its operational chaos, Brooke said, which is a different thing. Only if Caldwell decides to see it that way. He will. He said it without drama, which made it more convincing than if he'd tried to reassure her. I've known Everett Caldwell for 6 years. He's not a man who's looking for someone to blame. He's looking for someone to trust with his operation. He paused. What you've built here in a month, the records, the crew, the kitchen, that's what it looks like when someone actually cares about the thing they're managing. She thought about what that meant in practical terms. Shaw, a cattle buyer with serious resources, sitting at a table and deciding whether Dust Creek Ranch was a place he wanted to do business with long term. The meal he'd eat while making that decision. She looked at the stove. She looked at the kitchen. I'm going to need to arrange some things, she said. Rourke read her expression. Something shifted in his face, the particular quality of a man who has just understood something that wasn't said out loud. The kitchen's budget is yours to manage, he said carefully. Whatever you need. I don't want the ranch's money, she said. What I have on hand should be enough. He looked at her steadily. Elena, I've been buying clean supplies for a month, she said. I know what's available and what the quality is. I can work with what I've got. She turned back to the counter. I'd appreciate it if you'd let me work. A brief pause. All right, he said. He left her to it. She spent the rest of that afternoon and the following day in the kind of focused, methodical planning she did best. Not inspiration, not performance, but the disciplined work of someone who understands that the quality of what arrives on a table is determined almost entirely by what happens in the 24 hours before it gets there. She made arrangements with Clara Bates for a specific order to be ready for pickup the morning of Caldwell's arrival. She went through her stores and identified what she had that was genuinely excellent versus what was merely serviceable, and she built her planning around the excellent, which meant being specific and restrained rather than ambitious. She thought about what the dinner needed to do. Not impress, impressiveness was a shallow target, and sophisticated men could smell it. It needed to demonstrate something, that this kitchen had discipline and standards, and could be relied upon to produce consistent quality with available resources. It needed to feel like a working ranch kitchen operating at full competence, not a dining room trying to be something it wasn't. She planned accordingly. On the third day, Tanner sent for her. She went to his office with the same level expression she'd been wearing since the confrontation in the yard, not cold, not hostile. Just the face of someone who has made peace with where they stand and is not interested in pretending otherwise. Tanner was behind his desk. He had a document in front of him, and he looked like he had been staring at it for a while before she came in. Caldwell arrives tomorrow, he said. I know. I want to be clear about something, he said. His voice had lost most of the authority it had carried in their first meeting. Not because he was frightened exactly. She didn't think Roy Tanner frightened easily, but because he had done the same calculations she had and arrived at the same answer, which was that his position was significantly weaker than he had believed 24 hours ago. Whatever you've told I told Caldwell what I found, she said. The same thing I told you the first week. He looked at her. You went over my head. You told me your concerns were noted and then dismissed them, she said. I had an obligation to the ranch's owner. An obligation. Something flickered in his face. Not quite contempt, something more complicated. The expression of a man who knows he is on the wrong side of an argument and is looking for a way to reframe the terms. You've been here 5 weeks. Yes, she said. And you've been managing this ranch for 11 years, and the supplier you've been working with for 11 years has been charging Caldwell for goods that weren't delivered and quality that wasn't provided. She looked at him directly. I have the figures if you'd like to review them. The silence in the office was specific and complete. Tanner looked at the document on his desk. He didn't answer. Is there something you needed from me before tomorrow? She asked. Another pause. Just be ready, he said finally. It came out flatter than he'd probably intended, not a warning. Just the last position of a man who has run out of better options. I'm always ready, she said, and left. She went back to the kitchen and finished the afternoon's prep with the concentrated attention of someone who is managing something carefully, precisely because the stakes are real. She was not fearless, she was aware. In the honest way she'd always been aware of things she couldn't afford to suppress, that tomorrow could go badly. Caldwell was a man she had never met. Rourke's confidence in him was genuine, she believed, But Rourke was also a man who had been sitting inside this situation for 8 months and had his own stake in its resolution. Shaw was an unknown quantity. Tanner would present his version of events with the practiced ease of a man who had been managing impressions for over a decade. She had her records. She had the crew. She had the kitchen. She went to bed at 10 o'clock and slept better than she had in weeks. Everett Caldwell arrived at Dust Creek Ranch on a Friday morning at 10:30. She saw him from the kitchen window, a tall man in his late 50s, stepping down from the buggy, with the deliberate, unhurried ease of someone who has the confidence of a person who does not need to announce himself to be taken seriously. He was lean and well-dressed without being showy about it, with the weathered look of a man who had made his money outdoors before he started managing it indoors. And he moved through the yard with the particular attention of someone taking inventory, not distracted, not posturing, just looking at everything with the direct, measuring gaze of someone who sees things for what they are. Beside him, climbing down from the other side of the buggy, was a man she took to be Gideon Shaw. Shaw was younger than Caldwell by perhaps 15 years, broader through the chest, with a face that had the specific quality of someone accustomed to evaluating things and offering very little in return for free. He looked at the ranch yard with less inventory and more assessment, the particular attention of someone who is deciding whether he wants to do business with what he's seeing. She watched Colton Rourke cross the yard to meet them. This was the moment she had been unable to fully anticipate, the moment when Rourke would shed the cowhand's posture she had watched him wear for 5 weeks and step into whatever space he actually occupied relative to these men. She watched him shake Caldwell's hand, and she watched Caldwell's face when he did it. And what she saw in Caldwell's face was not the greeting of an owner meeting an employee. It was the greeting of one businessman meeting another familiar, direct with the ease of existing trust. She went back to the stove. She had a meal to produce. They came to the kitchen at midday. Caldwell first, alone, while Shaw was being walked through the cattle records with Garrett Willis, who had been asked to handle that aspect of the tour with the comfortable authority of the ranch's longest-serving hand. She heard the door and turned around. Everett Caldwell stood in the doorway of her kitchen and looked at it the same way he'd looked at the yard, with the direct, measuring attention of someone seeing things as they are. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. He walked into the kitchen without waiting to be invited, which she noticed and respected. He looked at the stove, at the shelving, at the organized stores along the back wall, at the prep counter where she was working. He moved along the shelving and examined the delivery log she kept there. She had set it out deliberately that morning, open to the current page, a visible record of 5 weeks of incoming goods. He spent a full minute on the delivery log. "You bought supplemental supplies out of your own pocket," he said, without looking up. "I kept the receipts," she said. "I intended to document it against the delivery record so you could see the cost comparison." He looked up at her. "Colton told me," he said. "He said it was the first thing you did when the Voss goods weren't serviceable. You sourced clean alternatives and documented the difference." He held her gaze. "Most people would have complained and waited." "Complaining and waiting doesn't feed anyone," she said. Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile, more the expression of someone recognizing something they'd been told to expect and finding that the reality is accurate. He put down the delivery log. "I owe you a month's worth of receipts," he said. "You don't owe me anything yet," she said. "We should see how today goes first." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "Fair enough," he said. He left the kitchen and she went back to work. The dinner was at 7. She had arranged the ranch's main table, the long one in the house's central room, which was used for meals when Caldwell visited, and had spent the last several months serving as a secondary storage for miscellaneous equipment with the help of Danny Fitch, who had spent an hour that afternoon moving boxes and sweeping floors with the focused energy of a young man who understood that something important was happening and wanted to be useful to it. She had prepared 5 things, which she believed was exactly the right number, enough to demonstrate range, few enough to demonstrate discipline. A roasted beef from the best cut she'd selected herself from the stockyard at Clara Bates's supplier recommendation, handled with the slow, attentive method her mother had taught her, and which produced something deeply different from what came out of a kitchen that was cutting corners on time or temperature. A corn pudding that used the good dried corn she'd been storing, slow cooked to the particular consistency that required patience rather than technique. Fresh bread, real bread, not biscuits, because she had the time today, and because the smell of proper bread in an enclosed space does something to people's expectations that nothing else quite replicates. A cold preserved vegetable relish from the stores she'd been building for 3 weeks, layered with the careful balance of acids and salt her mother's recipe had specified, and a simple broth-based gravy that used everything she'd developed from the roast, because the quality of a cook's fundamentals shows in gravy more clearly than almost anywhere else. It was not a fancy dinner. She had not tried to make it one. What it was accurate, a meal that told the truth about what this kitchen could do with good materials and proper attention. She sent it out with Danny carrying dishes and herself managing the timing and the temperature, and she stayed in the kitchen while the meal was served, as she always did, because the kitchen was her place and the table was theirs. She heard the conversation through the wall, not the words, which were too low and far away, but the quality of it, the particular pace and rhythm of a table where people are eating well and talking freely, which is different from the pace of a table where they're going through motions. About 40 minutes in, Gideon Shaw appeared in the kitchen doorway. She turned around. He was a man who filled a doorframe without doing anything obvious to accomplish it. Just the particular physical presence of someone comfortable in his body and accustomed to being looked at. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Shaw," she said. "That beef," he said. He stopped there as if the sentence had completed itself. She waited. "My family's been in the cattle business since before I was born," he said. "I've eaten a lot of beef." He looked at her with the direct assessment she'd noticed from the yard. "What did you do to it?" "Nothing complicated," she said. "Good cut, proper temperature, enough time, and you leave it alone." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone evaluating an answer that is technically simple and practically very difficult. "Where did you get it?" he said. "Clara Bates, 15 miles east. She works with a stockman in the next county who's been doing things right for 20 years, and charging accordingly." She met his gaze. "It costs more per pound than what Voss has been delivering. It's worth more per pound than what Voss has been delivering." Shaw looked at the stove. He looked at the organized shelving. He looked back at her. "Caldwell tells me you've been documenting supply discrepancies since your first week," he said. "Yes," he showed me the figures. A pause. "The cumulative loss over the period Voss has been operating this way is considerable." "I see no," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the directness of a man who doesn't see the advantage in going around things, "I came here because Colton Rourke told Everett Caldwell that Dust Creek had turned a corner. I was skeptical. I've seen ranches that looked good for a visit and fell apart between inspections." She said nothing. She let him continue. "What I've seen today is not that," he said. "The crew is steady. The records are better than some counting houses I've worked with. And that meal," he stopped again. "That's a kitchen with standards. That's not an accident." "No," she said, "it's not." He nodded once. Then he said, "Caldwell wants to speak with you after dinner." "I'll be here," she said. He went back to the table. She stood at the stove with her hands on the edge of the work surface and let herself have 30 seconds of something she wasn't going to call relief yet, because Caldwell hadn't spoken to her and nothing was settled, and 30 seconds was all she could afford regardless. Then she went back to work. Caldwell came to the kitchen at 9 o'clock, after the table had been cleared and Shaw had retired to the guest room, with the unhurried manner of a man who has made his decision and is comfortable with it. He sat across the work counter from her with his hands folded and looked at her with the direct, measuring attention that was apparently his permanent expression. "Tanner told me his version this afternoon," he said. "I assumed he would," she said. "He says you disrupted established supplier relationships, incited the crew against ranch management, and overstepped your role as kitchen staff." He looked at her steadily. He filed those points formally. "I know. Colton's assessment is the opposite," Caldwell said. "He says you did exactly what needed to be done, and that his only regret is he didn't have what you built before you got here." She kept her expression even. "I'll tell you what I think," Caldwell said. "I think Tanner's been running this ranch with enough competence to keep it functioning and enough corruption to keep it bleeding. I think Voss has been stealing from me for years with Tanner's cooperation, and I think the reason I didn't know that is partly because I was relying on Tanner to tell me." He paused. "And I think you walked in here 5 weeks ago with nothing but your own judgment in a notebook and built a case that would hold up to scrutiny, which is more than I was able to do in 18 months, with a silent partner who owns a third of the ranch." She was quiet for a moment. "What happens to Tanner?" she said. "He's done at Dust Creek," Caldwell said. "Effective tomorrow. I'll be handling the transition directly until I find someone I can trust." He looked at her. "Voss is going to be handled through legal channels. The complaint he filed is going to be addressed with the documentation you compiled, which makes his complaint its own evidence." She absorbed that. "The crew," she said, "stays," Caldwell said. "All of them. With a wage adjustment that should have happened a year ago." He looked at the table surface for a moment. "Baines specifically, I heard about his brother. I'll arrange something." She said nothing. She felt something very large and very tired move through her, not a wave of feeling. Nothing so clean as that, but the particular interior experience of a long thing finally reaching its terminus, like a door that's been held against pressure for a very long time finally being allowed to close. "I'd like to offer you a formal position," Caldwell said. Operations manager for the kitchen and supply chain. Real wage formal authority over all incoming goods and supplier contracts. 6 months to start with review. She looked at him. I appreciate that, she said. I want to be honest with you about something. Go ahead, I came here because I needed work, she said. That's the honest truth. But the reason I'm still here, the reason I pushed back instead of backing down when Tanner told me to, is because I'm trying to build something of my own. In Whitmore Junction, a commercial kitchen and provisions business. She looked at him directly. I want this position. I'll do the work properly. But I'm not going to pretend that Dust Creek is where I'm building my future, because that's not honest. Caldwell looked at her for a long, still moment. How long do you need, he said. A year, she said. 18 months at the outside. Enough to stabilize the supply chain here and establish the Whitmore Junction operation. He nodded slowly. Operations manager for 18 months, full authority over supply. Formal reference for the Whitmore Junction business. Yes, she said. He extended his hand across the counter. She shook it. After he left, she sat alone in the kitchen for a while. The fire was low. The house was quiet. Outside, the ranch had settled into the deep quiet of late night. The horses still in the corral. The bunkhouse dark. The particular silence of a place where everything has been worked through and the people in it have gone to rest. She thought about Whitmore Junction. About the building she'd been corresponding with the owner, about for 3 months a solid, properly sized space on the main commercial street that she had been mentally laying out since before she came to Dust Creek. She thought about the provisions business, the supply contracts, the steady work of building something from the ground up that was entirely her own. She thought about what Caldwell had said. I think you walked in here 5 weeks ago with nothing but your own judgment and a notebook and built a case that would hold up to scrutiny. She thought about how it didn't feel like enough, even now. How the work ahead of her was longer than the work behind her. How that was the honest truth of starting something, and how she had known it going in and had decided to do it anyway. The kitchen door opened. Rourke. Of course it was Rourke. She wondered briefly if she would ever again hear that particular even tread without something in her chest doing a complicated thing. He came in and sat down across from her. He did not pour coffee. He just sat, with his hands on the table, and looked at her with the direct attention she had come to know as his particular way of being present in a room. Caldwell told me, he said. 18 months, she said. He also told me you turned down a permanent position. I told him the truth about what I'm trying to build, she said. I wasn't going to take a permanent offer under false pretenses. He was quiet for a moment. He respects that, Rourke said. He told me he respects that, I know. He also shook my hand, which was more useful. Something moved at the corner of Rourke's mouth. Not quite a smile, the thing it became before it was a smile. The reference he's offering you, he said, for Whitmore Junction. From Everett Caldwell, that carries real weight in this region. I know. Shaw told me tonight that if your provisions business can supply beef at the quality of tonight's dinner with any regularity, he'd want to talk about a railway contract. He paused. He said it like he was throwing it away, which with Shaw means he was serious. She absorbed that, a railway contract. The scale of it sat there in the kitchen between them, very large and very quiet. He'd talk to a woman about a railway contract, she said. Not cynicism, just an honest question. Shaw talks to anyone who can deliver what they say they can, Rourke said. He doesn't care much about anything else. She nodded slowly. The fire in the stove had burned to almost nothing. The kitchen was cooling. In the morning there would be 27 men to feed breakfast to, and a new operational reality to begin managing, and the long work of 18 months ahead of her. She thought about the notebook in her apron pocket, about the first page where she had written the date of her arrival and the inventory of what she'd found, about how much had changed since then, and how much of it she had not anticipated when she walked through the kitchen door for the first time with her sleeves already rolled up. Rourke, she said. He looked at her. Thank you, she said, for standing in that yard. He held her gaze. You'd already won by the time I walked out there, he said. I just made sure Tanner knew it. She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had walked into her kitchen at odd hours and dried her dishes, and warned her about things he had no reason to explain, and hidden a very large secret in plain sight for 8 months. Who had stood beside her without standing in front of her. Who had, she thought, understood from the beginning that the work she was doing had to be hers, and had protected that even when it would have been easier to simply fix the problem himself. She understood, looking at him in the low light of the dying kitchen fire, that there was a great deal more to be said between them. She also understood, with the same clarity, that tonight was not the night to say it. Go get some sleep, she said. I need to start breakfast early. He stood. He picked up his hat from the peg by the door. He paused with his hand on the door and looked back at her once, not long, not searching, just a look, and then he went out into the dark. She banked the stove. She put her notebook in her pocket. She turned off the lamp. She stood for a moment in the dark kitchen, in the quiet of a ranch that had changed in the last processes, in ways that were going to take time to understand fully, and she let herself feel the weight of what had been built and what still needed building, and the very specific, complicated feeling of being exactly where you intended to be, even though the path to get here had been nothing like what you planned. Then she went to bed. She had a long day tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. She was used to long days. She had always done her best work in them. The morning after Caldwell left, Roy Tanner was gone before breakfast. She didn't see him go. Nobody did. As far as she could tell, he had packed whatever he intended to take and left through the side gate sometime in the early hours, before the ranch came awake. His office was unlocked, which she discovered when she went to return the delivery receipts she had borrowed for documentation purposes. The desk had been cleared of his personal items. The chair was pushed in. The room had the particular quality of a space that has been deliberately vacated rather than simply left. She stood in the doorway for a moment. She had expected to feel something more substantial. When this moment came satisfaction, maybe, or the clean release of something that had been held at tension for too long. What she actually felt was closer to the absence of feeling, which was its own kind of information. Tanner was gone. The problem he represented was not entirely gone with him, because problems of that kind never resolve cleanly. They leave behind the residue of systems that operated a certain way for a long time and need to be carefully unwound before something new can function in their place. But the man himself was gone, and that was real, and she stood in the doorway of his empty office and acknowledged it. Then she went back to the kitchen and made breakfast. The crew ate with the particular quality she had come to recognize as the table's version of relief, not loud, not celebratory, just lighter than it had been. Old Heck Darden asked for seconds, which he had never done in her presence before. Danny Fitch talked for almost 10 minutes without checking over his shoulder once. Hector Baines, who had been eating with a careful deliberateness that she understood, was the physical expression of a man carrying financial worry, looked up halfway through the meal and met her eye and gave her the slow, direct nod of someone releasing a breath they had been holding for a long time. She refilled the coffee and said nothing, because sometimes the most useful thing you can do at a table is let people have their moment without turning it into a narrative. Caldwell's transition plan went into effect that same day. He had outlined it the night before, a temporary management structure that gave operational authority to Garrett Willis, while a replacement ranch manager was identified, with Elena holding formal authority over supply and kitchen operations. It was not a perfect solution, and Caldwell had said so himself. Garrett was an experienced hand but not an administrator by training, and the paperwork side of ranch management was going to be a learning process. But he was honest, and he had been there longer than anyone, and the crew trusted him. And in a situation where trust had been the primary casualty, those qualities outweighed the others. She spent the first 3 days of the new arrangement in a kind of organized intensity that she recognized as her natural mode when the situation required it. She went through the supply contracts line by line, identifying which ones were tied to Voss and which were independent arrangements that could be maintained or renegotiated. She drafted a new purchasing protocol, the framework she had been building in her head since the second week, the one that required delivery verification against invoice weight and condition before any receipt was signed. She wrote it out in the clear, unambiguous language of a practical operating document rather than an official policy, because she had learned that documents people can actually use are more effective than documents that merely cover their authors. She gave it to Garrett on the 3rd day. He read it at the kitchen table, slowly, with the expression of a man who is genuinely processing what he reads rather than performing the act of reading. This would have stopped Voss in the first month, he said when he finished. It would have stopped him on the first delivery if it had been in place, she said. But we're starting from now. He looked at the document. I'll implement it this week, he said. I know you will, she said. She meant it as a plain statement of fact, which was how he took it, and which she thought was one of the more useful things that had happened between them over the past 5 weeks, that they had arrived at a place where a straightforward expression of confidence didn't require elaboration. On the 4th day after Caldwell's departure, a letter arrived for her from Whitmore Junction. She had been waiting for it, and she had been trying not to think about the fact that she had been waiting for it, because the waiting made her aware of how much she had staked on its contents. She had been in correspondence with the building owner in Whitmore Junction, a man named Frank Delaney, who had inherited the property from his father and had been uncertain for some time about what to do with it for nearly 3 months. The space was right, ground floor, large enough for commercial kitchen equipment, with a separate storefront area that could serve as a provisions counter. The location was right. Whitmore Junction was a growing town with a railway line and a regular supply of people who needed goods and meals and the kind of provisions infrastructure that didn't yet exist there at any serious scale. The price was not right, but she had a plan for the price. She opened the letter in the kitchen after breakfast, standing at the prep counter with the noise of the morning's cleanup going on around her and the particular held-breath quality of someone reading something that matters. Frank Delaney regretted to inform her that a competing offer had been made on the property. She read the letter twice. Then she set it down on the counter and looked at the far wall. The competing offer had come from a commercial investment group based in Abilene. The offer was higher than she could match. Delaney expressed genuine regret and said he had valued their correspondence and hoped circumstances might be different. He said he had not yet signed anything, that the group's representative was coming to Whitmore Junction the following week to finalize terms, and that if her situation had changed significantly since their last correspondence, he was willing to hear from her before that meeting. She thought about what she knew. An investment group based in Abilene, moving on a commercial property in Whitmore Junction, 1 week before finalization. She thought about Harlan Voss, whose operation was Abilene adjacent, whose network of business connections extended through the region, and whose complaint against her had been filed with the particular specificity of someone who knew the details of her situation. She thought about whether she was being paranoid. She decided she was not. She wrote back to Delaney that afternoon. She told him that her situation had changed significantly, that she was now in formal employment at Dust Creek Ranch in an operations capacity, with a reference from Everett Caldwell, and that she had reason to believe the competing offer was connected to the same network of business interests that had recently been investigated for supply fraud at the ranch. She said she understood if that information was insufficient, but that she felt he had the right to know it before he made his decision. She did not beg. She did not dramatize. She stated the facts as she knew them and sealed the letter and sent it. Then she went to find Rourke. She had seen him every day since Caldwell's departure, but their interactions had been operational, the practical business of the transition, supply logistics, crew management. They had been working in close enough proximity that she had noticed, with the peripheral awareness she had developed for him over 5 weeks, that he was also doing the things she was doing, keeping the interaction professional and bounded, managing the distance between what they were dealing with on the surface and whatever was underneath it. She was done managing the distance. She found him at the South Corral doing the unglamorous work of fence repair that had apparently been deferred for months, and she said without preamble, "The Whitmore Junction building is under a competing offer." He straightened and looked at her. She told him about the letter, about the Abilene Investment Group, about the timing. She told him what she suspected about Voss. She told him that she had already written to Delaney and that she intended to go to Whitmore Junction herself if it came to that. He listened to all of it. "When does the investment group's representative meet with Delaney?" he said. "Next week." He didn't give a specific day. "What do you need from me?" She looked at him. She had prepared herself for this question, had thought carefully about what she was going to say, because getting it wrong mattered and she knew it. "I need Caldwell's reference letter in writing," she said. "The formal one he offered, dated and signed." She paused. "And I need to know if you have any way to find out whether the Abilene Investment Group is connected to Voss." "I can find that out by tomorrow," he said. "Then I'd appreciate it." He nodded. He picked up his fence tool. He started to turn back to the work and then stopped. Delaney said. She waited. He set the fence tool down again. He looked at her with the particular quality of attention. He had the direct, undeflected gaze of someone who has decided to say the thing rather than circle it. "I want to help with this," he said. "Not because of the ranch connection or because of Voss or because Caldwell asked me to. I want to help with this because it's yours and it matters." She held his gaze. "I know the difference," he said, "between helping someone do their own thing and doing it for them. I won't cross that line." She had thought about this, about him, about the particular difficulty of the situation, about what it meant to be in the position of building something yourself while someone with significantly more resources than you wanted to be useful. She had thought about how easy it would be to let that help become dependency, and how a man with Rourke's resources could make that happen without meaning to, simply by being willing. "I know you won't," she said. And she meant it, which surprised her slightly. He nodded once. She went back to the kitchen. The news about the Abilene Investment Group came the following evening. Rourke came to the kitchen with the information, the same way he brought everything, flatly, specifically, without embellishment. The investment group had 2 principals. One was a legitimate commercial investor based in Abilene with a clean record, and no connection she could identify to Voss. The other was a man named Dale Pritchard, who was Harlan Voss's brother-in-law and who had been operating as a commercial property investor in the region for approximately 4 years. She absorbed that. Voss is trying to buy the building, she said. Pritchard is buying it, Rourke said, which is different on paper and identical in practice. She thought about that for a moment, about what it meant, about the particular flavor of it. Voss, who had been operating a fraud scheme at Dust Creek for 11 years, who had sent men to try to pull her crew apart, who had filed a formal complaint against her that had been dismantled by her own records, was now attempting to purchase the building she intended to turn into her business. It was not abstract. It was personal, and she allowed herself to feel the anger of it clearly for a moment before she put it somewhere useful. "He can't stop me with a building," she said. "There are other spaces in Whitmore Junction." "There are," Rourke said, "but none of them are what you've been planning for. None of them have the layout, the location, or the access to the railway line." He looked at her steadily. "He's not trying to stop you with a building. He's trying to send a message." She knew that. She had known it as soon as she worked out the connection. "The message being that his reach is longer than his legal problems," she said. "Yes." She stood at the counter and thought. "What does Delaney actually want?" she said. "Not what the money says. What does the man actually want?" Rourke considered that. "He inherited the property," he said. "He's been uncertain what to do with it for 2 years. His father built that building for a provisions business that never got off the ground." He paused. "He's told you he valued your correspondence." She thought about Frank Delaney's letter, about the specific phrasing of it, the genuine-sounding regret, the deliberate notification that nothing was signed yet, the open door in the final paragraph. A man trying to tell her something without saying it. "He doesn't want to sell to Pritchard," she said. "I don't think he does," Rourke said. "I think he got an offer he can't ignore financially, and he's hoping you give him a reason not to take it." She looked at the counter. She looked at the notebook that was always in her apron pocket, the same notebook that had started this whole chain of events 5 weeks ago. The one she had filled with delivery dates and weights and witness names and figures that had, in the end, done exactly what she needed them to do. "I'm going to Whitmore Junction," she said. "When?" "Tomorrow." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll arrange a horse," he said. "I have access to the ranch horses," she said. "I'm the operations manager." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Right," he said. "Of course you do." She went to Whitmore Junction the following morning, leaving Danny Fitch with specific instructions for the day's meals and Garrett Willis with the operational notes she'd been keeping, and she rode the 15 miles in the early autumn air, with the notebook in her coat pocket and Caldwell's formal reference letter, which had arrived by wire the previous afternoon, because Caldwell was apparently a man who moved quickly when he decided to move folded carefully inside it. Frank Delaney was a man in his mid-60s with the tired, uncertain air of someone who has been responsible for something he did not choose to be responsible for, and has been managing that feeling for long enough that it shows in how he stands. He met her in the building itself at his suggestion, she realized, which told her something. The space was exactly as she had pictured it. Better, in some ways the ceiling height was better than she'd understood from the correspondence, and the eastern wall had windows that let in the particular quality of morning light that would matter enormously for a working kitchen. She stood in the center of the floor and looked at it, and let herself briefly see what it could be. Then she sat down across from Delaney at the small table he'd set up near the front windows, and she put the documents in front of him. She walked him through it the same way she had walked Tanner through her delivery record 6 weeks ago, methodically, specifically, without editorializing. The reference from Caldwell, who was, as Rourke had correctly noted, a name that carried real weight in this region. The documentation of her operational role at Dust Creek. The formal record of what Harlan Voss and his network had been doing at the ranch, which was now in the hands of the county commissioner's office, as well as Caldwell's legal representative. And the connection between Dale Pritchard and Harlan Voss, which she had documented as cleanly as she documented everything else. Delaney read it all. He was slow and thorough, which she respected. When he finished, he sat back and looked at the table for a long moment. "Pritchard came here last week," he said, before the formal offer, "just to look at the building." He paused. He walked through it the way someone walks through something they've already bought. She said nothing. "My father built this building for a reason," Delaney said. He was looking at the windows, at the light coming through. He wanted it to be a working space, something that made things and sold them and was useful to this town. He looked at her. He didn't get there. He got sick before the business could start, and I inherited an empty building and a lot of plans he never got to execute. He was quiet. "Pritchard's going to put a land speculation office in here. I know that because he told me, thinking it was a selling point." Elena waited. "How much can you offer?" he said. She told him the number. It was below Pritchard's offer, she said so plainly. He looked at her for a long moment. I want an agreement, he said. That says what you intend to do with this building. Specifically. I'll write it today, she said. He extended his hand across the table. She shook it. She rode back to Dust Creek in the late afternoon, and the thing she felt was not triumph, it was more specific than that, more grounded. It was the feeling of a decision made and honored by another person, which is one of the rarer things you encounter in a life that involves transactions, and she understood that it would not always go this way, and that this particular outcome had required not just what she had built, but also the character of a man she had never met before today, and the accidental grace of documents that happened to say the right things in the right order. She was aware, riding back through the flat country with the late sun behind her, that she was also tired in a way she had not permitted herself to feel until this moment. 6 weeks of sustained pressure, of managing things that mattered enormously, while presenting the surface of someone who had everything in order. The body keeps that account even when you don't, and hers was presenting the bill. Rourke was at the corral when she rode in. He watched her dismount without saying anything, and when she had given the horse over to Danny and turned around, he was still there. Well, he said. He signed, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Good, he said. It was a plain word, and it was the right one, and she thought, not for the first time, that she had come to trust the plainness of him in a way she had not expected and could not easily explain. Voss is going to find out, she said. He already knows he lost the building, Rourke said. Pritchard would have told him by now. He'll try something else. Probably. He looked at her directly. He's going to try a lot of things over the next year or two while his legal situation sorts itself out. That's just the reality. She knew that. She had always known that resolving a situation like this was not the same as ending it, that Voss would continue to exist and to have interests and to be a person with resources and motivations, and that some portion of the next several years would involve dealing with whatever those interests produced. Then I'll deal with it, she said. When it happens. He nodded. They stood in the yard in the cooling evening, and she thought about what she wanted to say and whether this was the right moment for it. And then she thought about the fact that she had spent 6 weeks managing moments and being precise about timing, and that this was not a delivery receipt or a witness statement and didn't require that kind of management. I want to say something, she said. He looked at her. When I came here, she said, I had a notebook and a plan and about $40 I'd saved, and I had an idea about what I was capable of, but I hadn't had a real chance to find out. She paused. You watched me find out. You didn't try to speed it up, or make it easier, or protect me from the parts that were difficult. She looked at him directly. That's not nothing. That's actually quite rare. He held her gaze. You didn't need me to make it easier, he said. No, she said. But a lot of men would have tried anyway, because it would have made them feel useful, or because it would have put me in a position of owing them something, or because they genuinely couldn't tell the difference between helping and taking over. She paused. You knew the difference. Something in his face shifted, not the corner of the mouth thing she'd learned to read, but something deeper. The expression of a person who has been seen in a specific way they didn't know they could be seen. Elena, he said. I'm not finished, she said. He waited. I'm going to be in Whitmore Junction in 18 months building a business that's going to take everything I have, she said. It's going to be hard, and it's going to go wrong in ways I can't predict, and there are going to be days when I'm not sure it was the right decision. She looked at him. I don't need someone to make that easier. I need someone who's willing to stand beside it. The yard was very quiet. The horses were still in the corral. Somewhere across the ranch, she could hear the low sound of the bunkhouse, the particular murmur of men at the end of a day. I know how to stand beside things, Rourke said. His voice was quiet and direct and completely without performance. I know you do, she said. That's why I'm saying it to you. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she felt the weight of it, the real consideration of it, which she respected more than a quick answer. All right, he said. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise dressed up in sentiment. It was a man who said what he meant and meant what he said, telling her that he was in. And she understood with the same clarity she had brought to everything else in the last 6 weeks, that this was exactly the right answer and that she trusted it. They walked back toward the house in the evening air, not touching, not talking, which was its own kind of language between people who have been through something real together and don't need to ornament it. The following months moved the way hard months do, not slowly, not quickly, but with the specific density of time when you are doing a great deal all at once and cannot afford to let any of it slip. She managed the Dust Creek supply chain through the autumn and into winter, implementing the purchasing protocol she had written, establishing new supplier relationships that replaced the Voss network with smaller, more reliable sources, and overseeing the transition through 2 delivery cycles clean enough that Caldwell's quarterly review produced figures that made him write her a letter of commendation she put in the folder with her receipts and her reference and the lease she had signed with Frank Delaney. The legal proceedings against Voss moved at the pace that legal proceedings always move slower than the people affected by them would prefer, and with the infuriating regularity of something that is technically progressing, while appearing to stand still. By winter, Harlan Voss had retained legal representation and filed 3 countermotions that postponed the primary hearing by 60 days each. His Abilene connections proved, as Rourke had predicted, to be genuinely useful to him. In the short term, he had enough goodwill and enough favors owed that the wheels of the process ground more slowly than justice probably required. But they ground. The documentation she had compiled was specific and dated and signed, and the county commissioner's office had appointed an investigator who had found, in the Voss trading ledgers, exactly the kind of systematic discrepancy that matched what her records showed. 2 other ranches in the region filed supporting complaints. By spring, Voss's position had contracted from defensive to genuinely precarious. Dale Pritchard had withdrawn from the Whitmore Junction property negotiation without comment, which she took as the signal it was. In the spring, she made her first visit to the Whitmore Junction building with a carpenter named Ruiz, who had been recommended by Clara Bates, and who walked through the space with the professional attention of someone reading a text in a language he knew well. She told him what she needed: the equipment positions, the ventilation requirements, the layout of the storefront counter, and he listened without interrupting, and then told her what it would cost and how long it would take. The cost was higher than she had planned for. The timeline was 3 months, which was reasonable. She agreed to both. She told Rourke about it that evening. He listened, and when she'd finished, he said, "Do you have enough for the first month's operating costs after the renovation?" She had calculated it 6 times. "Barely," she said. "If the first supply orders come in at the price I've negotiated, and I have 2 business contracts in the first 4 weeks, yes." He said nothing for a moment. "Shaw sent me a letter," he said. She looked at him. "He wants to meet in Whitmore Junction," Rourke said. He said, "and I'm giving you his exact words because they're specific, that he wants to see the operation before he commits, but that, if it looks like the dinner at Dust Creek, he'd like to discuss a quarterly provisions contract for the railway station at Whitmore Junction." She sat with that for a moment. A quarterly provisions contract with Gideon Shaw's railway interests was not a small thing. It was the kind of contract that created the financial foundation a new business needed to survive the first year, which was the year most new businesses did not survive. "When does he want to meet?" she said. He said, "Whenever you're ready," Rourke said. Those were his words, "whenever you're ready." She appreciated that, from a man like Shaw, that phrasing meant something. "In 6 weeks," she said, "when the renovation's far enough along that he can see what it's going to be." Rourke nodded. She looked at him. He was sitting across from her at the Dust Creek kitchen table, the same kitchen, where this entire long thing had started, and he looked back at her with the same patient, direct attention he had brought to every moment of the last several months. She thought about what it meant to build something, not the practical mechanics of it, which she understood well, but the human experience of it, the specific courage required to start a thing knowing you might fail, to keep going when the early obstacles are large enough to make failure seem more realistic than success, to hold the vision of what you're trying to create through the days when the gap between where you are and where you're trying to get is so wide it seems impossible. She thought about the women she had known who had tried to do things like this and been talked out of it. Not dramatically, nobody had stood in their way and forbidden them. They had simply been worn down, incrementally, by the accumulated weight of people suggesting smaller ambitions, and had eventually accepted smaller ambitions as their own. She thought about her mother, who had kept books on every pound of flour that came through the kitchen door and taught her that carefulness was a wall, and who had died before she could see what that carefulness had built. She thought about Garrett Willis, who had lived with 11 years of quiet guilt and had finally walked into her kitchen and told the truth, and whose wage had been corrected, and whose daughter in Amarillo was now receiving more money every month, and who said at Christmas, in the particular flat way he had, that it had been a good year. She thought about Danny Fitch, who had learned to stop checking over his shoulder, and who was now tentatively talking about staying at Dust Creek long enough to work his way into a management position, who had written a letter to his parents in Ohio, describing his situation with what she understood, reading it, was the first real confidence she had heard from him. She thought about Heck Darden, 72 years old, eating seconds at breakfast. She thought about Hector Baines's brother in Lubbock, whose fever had cleared by February, paid for in part by the wage correction Caldwell had made good on. These were the things that happened when a kitchen ran right, not just the food. Everything around it, the dignity of being properly fed, the stability of knowing that the basic things were being handled honestly, The specific difference it makes to people's lives when someone decides that the corners are not going to be cut on their account. She had not set out to change anyone's life. She had set out to do her job. These were not the same intention, but they had produced the same result. And she understood that this was not something she had caused so much as something she had allowed by simply refusing to look away. "I want to tell you something," Rourke said. She looked up from her thoughts. He was looking at the table, which was unusual. He was not a man who looked away when he spoke. "When I came to Dust Creek," he said, "I came because Caldwell needed someone to find out what was wrong. I thought that was a practical problem with a practical solution. Identify the fraud, document it, give Caldwell what he needed to act." He paused. "I was here 8 months and I couldn't get there. Not because I didn't have access to the information, but because I was watching the situation from the outside. I was observing it instead of being in it." He looked up at her. "You walked in and started being in it on the first day. You made the food better and you watched the men eating it, and you felt what it meant that they were eating badly, and that was what made the rest of it possible. You didn't investigate the fraud. You cared about the people it was affecting, and the investigation came out of that." She looked at him for a long moment. "I was angry," she said honestly. "Most of what I did in the first 2 weeks I did because I was angry." "I know," he said. "That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the anger came from the right place, from caring about something real." He met her eyes. "Not everyone's anger does." She thought about that. "No," she said, "not everyone's does." The fire in the stove was low. The kitchen was warm in the way it got in early spring when the days had started to turn, and the evenings still held some of the winter's chill. Outside, the ranch was quiet, with the particular quiet of a place that had found its footing after a long period of instability, not perfect, never perfect, but functional and honest and tended. She had 6 weeks left at Dust Creek before she transitioned to Whitmore Junction full-time. She had a building that needed finishing, and a carpenter who was 3 weeks into a 12-week job, and a first supply order that needed to be negotiated before the end of the month, and a meeting with Gideon Shaw to prepare for, and 18 months of planning to begin executing. She also had a man sitting across from her who had told her, in plain language, that he was in, who owned properties in 3 counties and had resources she had no interest in depending on, who had watched her build something difficult from the ground up, and had offered his help without trying to take the wheel, who dried dishes when she was tired and told her hard things without softening them, and made the corner-of-the-mouth expression that was not quite a smile, and that she had come to know as one of her favorite sights. "Rourke," she said. He looked at her. "You should know," she said, "that this is going to be a long, impractical, frequently inconvenient thing. I'm going to be working too hard most of the time, and I'm going to be difficult on a regular basis, and there are going to be days when the business is all I have room for." "I know that," he said. "And you're still in," she said. "I'm still in," he said. She nodded. "Good," she said. "Because I could use a person who knows how to stand beside something difficult without trying to fix it into something easier." She paused. "And because I think you might need someone who doesn't care about your money." He looked at her for a long moment, and this time the corner-of-the-mouth thing resolved into something fuller, not a wide smile, not a performance, but the real expression of a man who has just heard something true about himself, stated plainly by another person, and who finds that he is glad to have been seen. "You don't," he said. "Not even a little," she said. She stood and went to the stove and banked the fire for the night, and he stayed at the table a moment longer, and then he stood as well and picked up his hat from the peg where it always hung, and they walked out into the spring evening together. Whitmore Kitchen and Provisions opened on the 14th of September, 7 months later, in a building on the main street of Whitmore Junction with good ceiling height and eastern windows that let in the particular quality of morning light she had noticed when she first walked through the space. The opening was not a ceremony. She did not hold ceremonies. She unlocked the door, put the provisions counter into service, and started work. By the end of the first week, she had 2 business contracts, the general store that had been sourcing from an unreliable supplier 2 towns over, and was grateful for the change, and the hotel on the main street, whose manager had heard about the dinner at Dust Creek from Gideon Shaw and had made an inquiry. By the end of the second week, the railway contract was in negotiation. It was hard. It was harder than she had planned for, because the first year of anything is harder than you plan for, and she had planned carefully, which meant the gap between her plans and reality was smaller than most, but still present and still costly. There were days when she was not sure. She kept those to herself, mostly not from pride, but because she had learned the difference between sharing difficulty with a person who can help you carry it and simply depositing it on them, and she preferred the former. Rourke came to Whitmore Junction twice a month, managing the distance between Dust Creek and her operation, with the same quiet practicality he brought to everything. He did not tell her what to do. He asked questions that were the right questions, not soft ones, not questions designed to make her feel better, but the honest inquiries of someone genuinely trying to understand a situation. He brought her information when he had it that was relevant to her business. He ate her food and told her honestly when something was better than it had been and when it was not quite there yet. She thought, on a November evening when the kitchen was finally quiet, and the accounts for the month showed for the first time a number that was larger than what it needed to be. He was exactly what he had said he would be. Someone who knew how to stand beside something difficult without trying to fix it into something easier. Harlan Voss's legal proceedings concluded the following spring. The verdict was not dramatic, these things rarely are, but it was clear. He was found to have operated a systematic fraud against multiple ranching operations in the region over a period of several years, and the financial remediation that followed was significant enough that his ability to operate at scale in the region was effectively ended. He retained his personal assets, which was the kind of outcome that left a bitter taste, but the network was dismantled, and the county commissioner's office implemented new supply verification standards that would make the same scheme considerably harder to run again. She read about it in the Whitmore Junction paper on a Thursday morning before the kitchen opened. She folded the paper and set it aside. She thought about the first day she had come to Dust Creek and stood in the kitchen and found a flour barrel full of weevils. She thought about the list she had made on the back of an old receipt. She thought about 27 tired men eating bad food in resigned silence, and the specific quality of injustice that is so ordinary it has stopped being noticed. She thought about what it cost to notice things that have been arranged to go unnoticed. She thought about her mother who had been careful, and what carefulness had built. There are people who will tell you that strength is about not needing anyone, that the purest version of self-determination is doing everything alone. She had believed something like that once, not explicitly, not as a philosophy, but as a posture. The way you can carry a belief in your body before your mind has examined it. She didn't believe it anymore. What she believed in its place was something harder to say cleanly but more true, that strength was in knowing what you were capable of and holding on to that clearly, and that the right person, the person worth having, was not the one who needed you to be less so they could be more, but the one who looked at what you were capable of and wanted to see where it went. She had found that. She had not expected to find it at a ranch in the middle of nowhere with 27 tired men and a flour barrel and a notebook. But you find things where you find them, and the wisdom is in recognizing what you've found. The kitchen opened at 6. By 8 it was running at full capacity. By noon the provisions counter had served 14 customers, and the hotel order had gone out, and the railway station supply run had been completed by the young woman she had hired in October, who had turned out to be exactly as capable as Elena had thought she would be. By evening, the accounts were in order and the kitchen was clean, and the orders for tomorrow were organized, and everything that needed to be done had been done. She stood in the eastern light of the kitchen she had built, with her own hands and her own money, and her own stubborn refusal to accept that smaller was the only option available to her, and she thought about what came next. There was always something that came next. That was not a burden. That was the whole point. She put on her coat and locked the door and walked out into the Whitmore Junction evening. Rourke was waiting at the end of the street, leaning against the fence rail with his hat on and his arms crossed, and the patient, unhurried quality of a man who is exactly where he intends to be and in no rush to be anywhere else. She walked toward him. He looked up and watched her come, and the corner of the mouth thing happened, and she thought, there it is. She had built this. She had built all of it, the kitchen, the business, the documentation that had dismantled Voss's operation, the crew that had held together when it was asked to, the relationships that were now real and lasting rather than instrumental and temporary. She had built it without giving anything away that she wasn't prepared to give, without becoming something smaller than what she was, without waiting for someone to decide she was worth taking seriously. And she had found, in the building of it, that doing something hard with your whole self does not preclude also being known by another person. That strength and love are not a trade-off, that the man worth choosing is the one who fell for you because you were standing, not because you needed catching. She reached him. Good day, he said. Long day, she said. Good at the end. He nodded. He fell into step beside her. They walked.